Good evening, my friends. Find a warm corner for yourself. Switch off the lights and put your phone aside. Tonight, I will not tell you stories of monsters or ghosts. What I will share with you are memories. Memories that cling like shadows. Memories that no one wishes to recall, yet they live on, buried in silence, etched like scars deep within the soul. They are the whispers you never admit to hearing, the flicker you never confess to seeing, the weight you carry without knowing why. These are not fairy tales. They are recollections of those who once brushed against the thin veil that separates the living from the unseen, and returned changed, haunted, unable to forget. So listen carefully, because some memories are not only theirs, some may already be yours. Story 1. The Drowning Hand. When I returned to my hometown after more than a decade away, I thought I was coming back to a place of quiet fields and familiar faces, to the dusty streets where the air smelled of cut hay and wood smoke, to the narrow porches where old neighbors rocked slowly in chairs and waved with hands as weathered as the barns around them. I thought it would be comfort, but comfort is a tricky thing. It can wrap itself around you in one moment, and in the next, it can turn to something colder, heavier, like a blanket that suddenly suffocates. My mother was waiting for me at the kitchen table the night I arrived, her eyes bright but lined with new creases, her hands folded in that way that meant she had been saving words for me. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared and the lamp above us buzzed faintly in the summer heat, she leaned forward and said, almost too softly for me to hear, "Did anyone tell you what happened to old Martha?" I remembered Martha, how could I not? In a town as small as ours, everyone knew her. She had been the woman who always had advice to give, herbs to brew, old sayings passed down from ancestors no one else could name. Some called her wise, others called her strange, but all agreed she belonged to the bones of the place. She nearly drowned, my mother whispered, her fingers tightening on the rim of her teacup, and not in the way you'd think. The river was low, barely to the knee, but she swore something pulled her under. I frowned. Pulled her? My mother nodded. She said there was a hand that gripped her leg and held her down. They found her screaming, thrashing, half submerged in water, shallow enough for a child to wade, and when they dragged her out, her voice faltered, her gaze fixed on the table as though the wood grain itself might shift into something terrible. When they dragged her out, there was a mark, a handprint dark and bruised into her skin, as if someone had been clutching her for hours, and she told me she wasn't the first. The lamp hummed louder. I felt the air in the room thicken, as if the very walls were leaning closer to listen. I tried to smile, to laugh the way I would have in the city. Mom, it's just Martha. She's always been dramatic. But my mother's eyes were flat with the kind of fear that doesn't need drama to make it real. She said another woman disappeared years ago in that same place. She said she used to hear stories from the old ones, long before even my time. Something waiting in that river, something that doesn't take you quickly. It holds you. It feeds on the fight, on the life running hot through your veins. It doesn't want the dead. It wants the strong, the living. Her voice dropped even lower, until I could barely catch the words. And it leaves them down there, in a silence you can't imagine, until their strength is gone, and all they have left is despair. I should have laughed again. I should have reminded her of every rational explanation, panic, muscle cramps, some trick of mud and weeds. But as she spoke, I found myself remembering the river. I remembered its slow, brown current, the way the cattails bowed in the wind, the way the water always seemed deeper than it looked, darker than it should have been, and I remembered the old stories too. Not in words, not in lessons told to me, but in the shape of warnings murmured by grandmothers, in the careful way people avoided the river at dusk. They never said why. They never had to. That night, long after my mother had gone to bed, I stood on the porch listening to the cicadas drone. My eyes drifted toward the line of trees where the river cut its path through the town. I could not see it, but I could feel it. A coolness on the air, a pull at the edge of thought. And for the first time in many years, I remembered what it was to be a child lying awake in that same house, hearing the slow lap of water against stone and imagining something beneath it, waiting, waiting, waiting. When I finally closed my eyes, sleep came fitful, broken by images that clung to me with a grip as strong as Martha's story. A woman's arm, thrashing, a bruise in the shape of fingers, a hand rising from water that did not ripple. I woke before dawn, my sheets damp with sweat, my breath quick, my heart telling me what my mind refused to admit. The river was not just a river. It never had been. The next morning, I walked the narrow road into town, the air still heavy with dew, the fields damp and silver under the early Sunday. My mother's words clung to me like the mist, and though I told myself I was only curious, I knew there was something more behind my steps. I needed to hear Martha's story with my own ears, not filtered through rumor or my mother's trembling voice. Martha lived in a house set back from the road, a weathered cabin with a roof that sagged in the middle and shutters that never closed quite right. The garden out front was wild, half-tamed herbs pushing up against weeds, jars of rainwater glinting faintly where she had left them to catch the sky. People in town said she was eccentric, but as I walked the uneven stones up to her door, I thought of her less as strange and more as someone the years had simply carved too deeply into. She opened the door before I could knock. "You're Sarah's boy," she said, her voice low and rasping, her eyes narrowing as though she had expected me. I nodded, and she gestured me inside. The house smelled of dried sage and old wood smoke. Light slanted through the curtains in fractured beams, painting the floor in broken gold. She led me to a table covered with mismatched cups, papers scribbled with handwriting too hurried to read, and a single glass jar, half filled with river water. "You've heard," she said simply, settling into a chair with a weight that made the old wood creak. I sat across from her. "My mother told me about the river, about what happened to you." "Oh, bah." Her laugh was bitter, a sound more like a cough. They always tell it like it was an accident, a stumble, but it wasn't. She pulled her skirt higher, revealing her leg. The bruise was still there, faded now, but still unmistakably shaped like fingers pressed too hard into flesh. "It held me," she whispered. "As surely as you hold a cup, as surely as you grip a rope, cold as stone, stronger than any hand I've known." Her eyes, sharp and clouded all at once, searched mine. "You think I'm mad, don't you? But I wasn't the first." I leaned forward. "That's what my mother said. You told her there was another woman." Martha's gaze drifted toward the jar of river water, her voice lowering as if she feared the current might be listening. "Her name was Helen. She vanished nearly 30 years ago. Went down to wash clothes, same as me. Folks searched for days. They found her basket. They found her shoes. But they never found her. Not even a scrap of cloth." She paused, her hands curling tight against the table. "I was just a girl then, but I remember the way the old men shook their heads. They said it had happened before, long before. They told us the river wasn't only water, it was a mouth that opened when it hungered." I felt the room tighten, the air thick and damp as though the river itself seeped through the walls. "But why you?" I asked. "Why not anyone else?" Her smile was small and humorless. "It doesn't take the weak. That's what you must understand. It takes those who burn too brightly, those whose strength spills from them like light through cracks. It feeds on life that refuses to dim." Her words sank into me, heavy, unwelcome. I thought of her, thrashing in shallow water, of Helen gone without a trace, of nameless others whispered only in fragments. "And you think," I began slowly, "it's still there?" Martha's eyes widened, almost pitying. "Child, it never left. The river never gives back what it keeps. And if you walk too close, if you listen too long, you'll feel it too." Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock and the soft rattle of wind against the shutters. I wanted to stand, to leave her words behind in that dim, herb-scented room, but my body would not move. Instead, my eyes drifted to the jar of river water at the center of the table. The surface trembled, though no one had touched it. Martha followed my gaze. "It calls," she murmured. "Even here, even now." When I finally rose to leave, the sunlight outside seemed thinner, the air heavier. Martha stood at her doorway, watching me with eyes that seemed older than the river itself. "Tell your mother," she called after me. "Tell her to keep you away from the water, because if it ever touches you, you won't escape a second time." As I walked back through town, I noticed the way people lowered their voices as I passed, the way they cut their eyes toward the river even when they spoke of other things. I realized then that the story was not only Martha's. It was woven into the silence of the town itself, into the way children were warned never to linger near the current, into the way the old stared too long at the water, as though searching for faces they once knew. The river was not forgotten, it was simply endured. And for the first time, I wondered if my return had not been a homecoming at all, but a summons. For days I tried to push Martha's words aside, to drown them with the chores of helping my mother, with the quiet rituals of a town that had learned to keep moving despite the shadows it carried. But every time I walked past the line of trees where the river curled behind the fields, I felt its pull, steady and patient, like the weight of a gaze I could never quite return. On the fourth evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon and cicadas sang their long dirge, I found myself standing on the path that led down to the water. I told myself I only wanted to see it again, to prove to my own restless mind that a river was only a river. But in truth, something deeper guided me. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps the summons Martha had spoken of. The river looked the same as it had in childhood, brown water sliding past reeds, stones half submerged, banks soft with mud. Yet the longer I watched, the less it seemed to move. The surface lay strangely flat, unbroken by current, as though the water were holding its breath. And then I heard it. Not the rush of water, not the insects. A voice, faint, low, curling up through the silence like smoke. At first it sounded like weeping, then like laughter, and then like both together. I froze at the edge, my heart pressing against my ribs, when suddenly a splash broke the surface. A woman was in the water. Her skirt billowed, her arms thrashing, her voice rising in sharp cries for help. I recognized her, Helen's niece, a young woman named Clara, who often passed my mother's house with laundry balanced on her hip. She was waist deep, but sinking, as if the earth itself had opened beneath her. I shouted her name, stumbling down the bank, the mud clutching at my boots. She screamed again, her hand flinging upward, eyes wide and wild. But what made my blood turn cold was not her fear. It was what held her. For in that shallow water, I saw it, a hand, pale and swollen, gripping her ankle with impossible strength. The fingers curved too long, the nails blackened, the skin, the sickly hue of something that had drowned long ago. Another hand rose beside it, clutching higher, bruising her calf. She kicked, fought, clawed at the air, but the grip only tightened. Her body jerked downward, dragged inch by inch into water that should never have been deep enough to swallow her. I lunged forward, grabbing her wrists. The cold from her skin surged into me, numbing my arms, but I held on, bracing my feet in the mud. Clara, hold on. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw not just terror, but a knowledge too old for her face. It's real, she gasped. It wants me. Her words broke into a scream as her body was yanked downward, hard enough to nearly tear her from my grasp. And then I saw more than hands. Beneath the surface, the outline of a figure stirred, a body or the echo of one looming just below, its hair floating like weeds, its face turned upward. The eyes were open, wide, glowing faintly in the dim light. Not one figure, several, shapes pressed against the underside of the water as though it were glass, their mouths opening in silent cries, their limbs twisted, reaching. The riverbed was not mud. It was a floor, and beneath it, the drowned still lived. My grip slipped. The water burned my skin with its cold. I could feel the pull, not only on her, but on me. A steady, dragging weight that wanted both of us. Behind me, a voice shouted someone from the bank running toward us. Strong hands clamped onto my shoulders, hauling me back. Clara screamed one final time as she was torn from my grasp. Her face vanished beneath the surface, bubbles exploding in frantic bursts, her arms flailing before they too were claimed. And then silence. The water lay flat again, smooth, still, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. I collapsed on the bank, my body shaking, my lungs heaving. The man who had pulled me back, one of the farmers from the edge of town, stood over me, his face pale. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. "It's taken her." I wanted to scream, to throw myself back into the water, but I could not move. My arms still throbbed with the echo of those hands, the bruising grip, the chill that had seeped into my bones. And when I looked down, I saw the mark. Faint, darkening quickly, a handprint pressed into my wrist. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Clara's screams tangled with the sound of rushing water in my ears. But worse than the memory was the certainty. I had seen them, the shapes beneath the surface, the drowned, still moving, still waiting. And now, with the bruise on my skin, I knew the truth Martha had tried to warn me of. The river does not forget those who touch it. Once it has you, it never lets go. The village did not take long to know. By the next morning, whispers had spread faster than the mist rising from the river. Clara was gone, and though the story could have been told in many ways an accident, a stumble, a slip on wet stone, no one believed such simple explanations anymore. Not after Martha, not after Helen, not after all the others who had slipped into silence without a trace. People gathered at the general store, their voices low but urgent, their eyes shifting always toward the trees, toward the hidden line of water beyond. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men who had fished those banks for decades swore they would never cast a line there again. And when the preacher rang the church bell that Sunday, he did not speak of faith. He spoke of caution, of shadows older than the town itself, of rivers that do not forgive. I sat in the pew, listening to the murmurs rising around me, but I could not join in. My hand ached beneath my sleeve, the bruise tightening like a noose. At first it had been faint, a smudge of violet shaped like a palm, but each day it deepened, the fingers darkening, the imprint sinking into the very grain of my skin. Sometimes at night, when I woke in a cold sweat, I swore I felt the pressure again, as though the hand still gripped me from beneath the surface, its cold weight pressing down through water that was no longer there. I kept the mark hidden from my mother. I told myself it would fade in time. Bruises always did, but this one did not. It grew. I returned to Martha, desperate for answers. She opened the door before I could knock, her eyes falling immediately to my sleeve, to the way I held my wrist stiff against my body. "It touched you," she said simply, no question in her tone. I pulled the fabric back. The bruise glistened in the dim light, dark and fresh as though it had just been pressed into place. Her face tightened. "You're marked now. It will not let you go easily." My voice cracked. "What does it want from me?" Martha shook her head. "Not death. Not yet. It wants your strength, your struggle. It feeds on what keeps you alive." That night, her words tangled with my dreams. I dreamt of Clara's hand slipping from mine, of Helen's shoes abandoned on the shore, of faceless shapes pressing against the river's surface like insects against glass. I woke gasping, the sheets damp with sweat, my wrist burning as though freshly branded, and in the silence of my room, I heard it the faintest tap, steady, rhythmic, as if fingers knocked gently against the window pane. The town's fear thickened. People began to board up their wells, to fetch water from springs farther away. Children were forbidden to play near the woods, but avoidance could not stop the whispers. At night, men claimed they heard splashing when the river should have been still. Women swore they saw pale figures drifting between the trees, shapes that vanished when called out to. Dogs refused to drink from the current, snarling and whining until dragged away. The river was no longer a background to the town. It was its center, a wound no one could close, and I, carrying its mark, felt as though the wound had already opened inside me. Each day I grew weaker. My mother thought it was fatigue, the stress of returning home after so long, but I knew better. The bruise pulsed with every heartbeat, its edges spreading like veins of ink. Sometimes I caught myself staring at water at a basin, at the rain slipping down the window, at the glisten of dew in the grass and feeling my breath catch, my chest tighten, as though something beneath the surface were waiting for me, waiting to pull, waiting to finish what it had begun. One evening, as I walked the road past the fields, I noticed people watching me. Their conversations stopped mid-sentence, their eyes tracing the way I held my arm close to my body. Whispers followed me down the lane. "He's been touched. It's in him now. He won't last long." I wanted to deny it, to shout that they were wrong, but deep inside I knew they weren't. The mark was no longer just a bruise. It was a promise. That night, I dreamed again. This time I was not on the bank watching. I was beneath. The water pressed down on me, heavy, infinite, its silence louder than any storm. Shapes surrounded me, faces blurred but eyes wide, arms reaching, hands closing around my wrists, my legs, my throat. They pulled me deeper, but I did not drown. I breathed water as if it were air, my chest rising and falling in rhythm with the current. And in the deepest dark, I saw them, the ones the river had taken. Not corpses, not spirits, something in between, held forever in the grip of hands that would never release. Among them, I thought I saw Clara. Her lips moved, her voice a whisper inside my skull. "It's your turn." I woke to find the bruise burning, the shape of the fingers darker than ever, the mark spreading up my arm like roots. And in that moment, I understood what Martha had meant. The river does not want the dead. It wants the living. And now, I belonged to it. I stopped trying to pretend the bruise would fade. By then it had stretched across my arm in pale, darkened tendrils, curling up my veins like roots searching for a heart. My strength drained faster each day. Not as if an illness consumed me, but as if something waited patiently, drawing on my struggle, feeding on every effort I made to resist. And that was when I began to understand. The river did not crave death. Death was too quick, too final. Death ended the harvest. It wanted what came before the fight, the gasping, the exhaustion, the hollowing out of hope. It wanted the slow unraveling of life. It wanted despair. The town was thick with fear, but fear alone did not stop the river. Another man vanished one morning on his way to the fields. A child came home with bruises around her ankles, claiming she had only been playing near puddles left by rain. People locked their doors, but water seeped under thresholds, whispered against window panes, tapped against wood in rhythms that no storm could explain. I heard it too. At first it was faint, the tap of knuckles against my window while I tried to sleep. Then it was closer, louder, inside the walls, inside my chest. Sometimes it sounded like a call for help. Sometimes it sounded like laughter. And sometimes it sounded like my own heartbeat, out of step with itself. Martha came to me once more, her body frailer than ever, her eyes shadowed with pity. "You felt it," she said, her voice a whisper, trembling like old wood. I nodded. Her hand, brittle and shaking, rested over mine, right where the bruise throbbed. "Listen to me. It does not want to kill you. It wants you to keep breathing, to keep fighting, to keep falling until you are empty. That is its feast. That is how it lingers." My throat was too tight for words. She leaned closer. "And when you have nothing left, you won't be gone. You'll be beneath, just like the others, forever." That night, I dreamed of the river one last time. The water was black glass, smooth, endless. I stood on its surface as if it were solid, but beneath me I saw them, the drowned, suspended in silence, their eyes fixed upward, their mouths opening and closing like fish with no air left. Among them were faces I knew: Helen, Clara, the farmer, others whose names I had never been told. And then I saw my own reflection staring back at me, except it wasn't a reflection. It was me, below, arms outstretched, bruises crawling across my skin, eyes empty of light. I woke with my chest heaving, my window rattling, the sound of tapping filling the room, not outside, inside. I do not know how long I have left before it claims me fully. I only know that the river is patient, and that it does not stop with one. Once you have heard it, once you have felt its mark, it never lets go. And perhaps it is not only me, because as I tell you this, I realize something. You've been listening closely. You've followed every word, seen the bruise in your mind, heard the splash of the water. You know the story now, and once you know, it knows you. So tonight, when the world grows quiet and the house leans into its silence, listen carefully. If you hear it, the faint knock, the slow rhythm of fingers tapping against glass, don't look toward the sound. Don't answer, because it is not death that waits on the other side. It is hunger, and once you are marked, it will feed until nothing is left of you but the despair it craves. The conversations in dreams. There are dreams that slip away as soon as you wake, vanishing like mist touched by sunlight. And there are dreams that linger, slow and heavy, pressing themselves into your waking hours until you begin to wonder whether they were dreams at all. Mine began with a girl, and from the first night I saw her, she seemed to know me in ways I could not explain, speaking as if we had shared 1,000 conversations before that moment, though when morning came I could never remember a single word we had exchanged. She appeared each night in places that felt both familiar and strange, landscapes that belonged to memory but shimmered like illusions, a wooden bridge stretching endlessly into fog, a field of tall grass that swayed without the push of wind. a room lined with shelves of books whose titles shifted every time I tried to read them. She was always there waiting, her smile calm, her presence steady, and though I could not recall the content of our talks, I always woke with the certainty that we had spoken for hours, that she had given me secrets I had begged to know, but which the morning would not allow me to keep. The only thing that remained was her name, repeated so clearly that it seemed carved into the silence of my room when I opened my eyes. Her name was Lily. At first I thought nothing of it, because a name in a dream is harmless, a quirk of sleep, no different from the way an image or a sound sometimes follows you out of slumber. But as the nights passed and her voice pressed that name into me again and again, I began to feel an unease that crept into my bones, because each dream ended the same way. She leaned closer, her eyes reflecting something deeper than affection, and she whispered almost tenderly, "Don't forget, we have an appointment." I was 40. By the seventh night, the unease had grown into something I could not laugh away. I tried to carry on with the rhythm of my days, listening to the kettle hiss on the stove, hearing the boards creak beneath my mother's steps, breathing in the scent of autumn leaves curling at the edges of the yard, but the name clung to me like a shadow. Finally, one morning, I spoke it aloud to my mother as she stood at the sink, and the plate in her hand slipped and shattered against porcelain before she turned toward me with a face drained of color and a voice unsteady with something I could not name. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, and when I told her that Lily came to me in dreams, that she said we talked, and that she insisted on some kind of appointment, my mother whispered a prayer under her breath and sat me down at the table. She explained, with the heaviness of someone reopening an old wound, that Lily had been the name of a girl from our town, a girl who had vanished years before I was born, a girl whose family once lived just down the road, a girl who was never found. Her eyes searched mine as she spoke, and though the house was warm, the chill that spread through me was deeper than winter. My mother said dreams were not always dreams, that sometimes they were doors, and that the ones who are lost find ways to use them, pressing themselves into the minds of those who are sensitive, those who will listen, those who cannot close the door once it has been opened. She said no more that morning, but by evening she asked me to come with her. We walked past the edge of houses, through fields that smelled of dry earth and smoke, until we reached a patch of ground where grass grew brittle and uneven, as if nothing had wanted to root there for years. "This is where she lived," my mother said softly, "where she was last seen." She knelt in the dirt, and with words I did not recognize, she began to draw patterns into the soil, her breath rising in the cool dusk, her voice carrying a rhythm that made the air grow heavy, as if the earth itself had leaned closer to listen. The atmosphere shifted as she spoke. The fading light dimmed more quickly than it should have. A wind rose that carried the faint perfume of lilies, too sweet, almost rotting, and I felt before I saw that we were not alone. When I turned, she was there, not in dream, not in the haze of sleep, but shimmering faintly in the air between twilight and night. Lily. Her hair fell in pale waves around her shoulders, her face familiar and yet sharpened with something unsettling. She smiled as if we had always known each other, her eyes locking on mine with recognition that made my knees weak. And then she spoke, though her lips barely moved, the sound filling my mind instead of my ears. "You remember my name?" she said. I wanted to answer, but my voice failed me. She tilted her head, the smile widening as if she had been waiting for this moment, and she whispered again, "You've forgotten what we talked about, haven't you?" But I haven't. I never forget. Tonight is the night. And with that, her figure wavered like smoke and vanished, leaving only the brittle grass bending in the wind and the fading perfume of her name. Lily. The following evening, my mother prepared as though she had been expecting this moment for years, her movements deliberate, her eyes never fully meeting mine, her lips pressed into a line that told me she carried more fear than she would admit. She gathered a small bowl, a bundle of herbs tied with red string, and a candle no larger than the palm of her hand, its wax stained by time. And though I wanted to ask her why she had kept these things hidden, the weight in her silence told me I was not ready to hear her answer. When the sun slid below the trees and the sky dimmed into the bruised purple of dusk, we walked again to the empty field. The land stretched wide and barren, a scar left where a house had once stood, and I could not shake the sense that the earth itself remembered what had happened there. My mother knelt in the brittle grass and placed the bowl on the ground, scattering the herbs into it with hands that trembled only slightly. She struck a match, its flare sharp against the gathering dark. and lit the small candle. The flame wavered, fighting against a wind that had not existed a moment earlier. She began to chant. The words rolled low in her throat, syllables older than the town, older than the language I knew, each one drawn out like a thread pulled from a fraying cloth. The air thickened, heavy, pressing against my skin, and I realized I was holding my breath. Then it happened. The candle guttered, bent low as if bowing to something unseen, and the darkness around us deepened, not gradually but suddenly, as though the field had been lowered beneath a vast shadow. The air filled with the faint sweetness I had noticed the night before, the scent of lilies only stronger now, thick, cloying, almost suffocating. I felt it before I saw it, the ripple in the air that told me we were no longer alone. At the far end of the field, between the crooked fence posts and the edge of the trees, the outline of a figure shimmered, faint at first, like heat rising from stone. My eyes strained to focus, and the shape grew clearer, step by step, as though the boundary between waking and dreaming had thinned enough for her to cross. It was Lily, not a pale flicker this time, not a shadow that vanished if I blinked, but a presence that seemed to belong to both worlds at once. Her dress hung in folds that shifted like water, her hair drifting though the wind had stilled, and her face, her face was exactly as I remembered from the dreams, familiar, intimate, yet sharpened by something that unsettled me deeply, as though what I had known of her had only been the mask she wore in sleep. Her eyes found mine and held them with a weight that made my chest tighten. She smiled, a slow curling of her lips that carried both recognition and triumph. "You came," she whispered, though her mouth barely moved. The sound pressed into my skull rather than my ears, a voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself. My mother's chanting grew faster, her voice taut with urgency, but Lily paid no attention to her. Her gaze remained fixed on me, and as she took another step closer, the light of the candle flickered wildly, shrinking against her presence. "You remember me," she said, tilting her head as if savoring the words. "You spoke my name. That is enough." I tried to answer, to tell her I didn't understand, that I had only seen her in dreams, but my throat closed around the words. The air was too thick, pressing down on me, heavy with the scent of decay wrapped in sweetness. She moved closer still, her outline sharpening until I could see the faint shimmer of her skin, the gleam in her hair, the pale light in her eyes. No longer a dream, no longer just a memory pressed into my mind. She was here. "You've forgotten what we talked about," she continued, her tone soft, almost tender, but laced with something sharper beneath. "But I haven't. I remember every word. I remember the promise. And tonight is the night." My mother's chanting broke sharply, her voice cracking with a word that sounded like a warning. She threw a handful of herbs into the flame, and the candle flared, spitting sparks into the air. For a moment, Lily's form wavered, her edges blurring as though smoke had passed across her. But then she laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, nor a kind one, but something in between, filled with knowledge I could not bear to touch. The sound rolled through the field, vibrating in the soil beneath my feet, echoing in the hollow of my chest. "You can't keep me away," she said. Her figure brightened again, solidifying against the flickering flame. "We are already bound." I stumbled backward, my breath sharp in my throat, but her eyes followed me, luminous and steady. The candle sputtered once more, then went out. Darkness swept over the field, deeper than night, the kind of darkness that feels alive. For a heartbeat, I thought I had lost sight of her, but then her face bloomed in front of me, so close I could see the faint cracks in her skin, the shimmer of something beneath it that was not flesh but shadow and light intertwined. Her voice slid into me like a whisper pressed against the inside of my ear. "You've forgotten, but I'll remind you. We have an appointment, and it begins tonight." The wind returned, fierce and sudden, scattering the brittle grass and waves. My mother pulled at my arm, dragging me back toward the road, her chanting lost to the storm. I turned once more toward the field, but Lily was gone. Only the scent of lilies lingered in the air, thick and clinging, and the echo of her words pulsed in my chest like another heartbeat. Tonight, after that night in the field, nothing returned to what it had been. The days stretched on in silence, but it was not the comfortable quiet of the countryside, not the stillness that comes with routine and familiarity. It was a silence that seemed to listen, a pause in the world as if something unseen was waiting for me to move. waiting for me to falter. My mother tried to carry on as though her ritual had succeeded, as though the boundary had been stitched closed again. But I saw the way her eyes followed me when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her lips formed prayers in the early dawn before I woke. She knew as well as I did that Lily had not gone. She had stepped closer. At first, Lily returned in dreams, though even that word began to feel meaningless. When I closed my eyes, she was there before thought could take shape. The places we stood were sharper now, less like landscapes conjured by imagination, and more like real places hidden just beyond my reach. A room with windows that opened onto a sea of darkness, a staircase that spiraled down without end, a bridge that led nowhere but back to itself. She spoke to me with a patience that was almost tender, but behind every word was an insistence, a reminder. She would lean close, her breath cool against my ear, though I knew no air passed between us, and she would say, "You promised me. Don't tell me you've forgotten. Our appointment is near." I would wake trembling, the words burning inside me like embers that refused to die, and yet when I tried to recall what promise she meant, I found only silence. Then, one night, there was no dream. There was only my room, dimly lit by the moon beyond the curtain, the air still with the faint hiss of crickets outside. I lay awake, unsure if sleep had abandoned me or if I had been carried somewhere I could not name. The silence deepened until even the sound of my own breathing seemed distant. And then she was there, not in haze, not in memory, but at the foot of my bed. Her figure shimmered at first, translucent, a presence I could almost dismiss as shadow. But as I stared, she sharpened, the air bending around her until her dress hung in folds of gray and her hair gleamed like strands of pale thread. Her eyes opened, wide and luminous, and her lips curved into that same knowing smile. "You see," she whispered, her voice rising from everywhere at once. "You can't escape me now. It was never just a dream." I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as though something pressed me into the mattress. My voice caught in my throat, words refusing to form. All I could do was stare as she moved closer, her step silent, her presence bending the room into something darker, smaller, until it felt as though the house itself was being folded into her shadow. "You made a promise," she said, her tone neither accusing nor kind, but certain, inevitable. "You said you would help me. You said you would bring me home." The memory flickered in me like a spark, faint but undeniable, a fragment of a conversation I had thought lost to sleep, my voice murmuring something, her hand reaching for mine, the weight of agreement passing between us, a promise sealed in words I could no longer recall, yet words that bound me all the same. "I don't remember," I whispered, the effort tearing through my chest. Her smile deepened, her head tilting as though in pity. "It doesn't matter. I remember. That is enough." She reached out then, her hand pale and trembling, though not with weakness. The moment her fingers brushed my skin, a chill surged through me, not sharp like ice, but deep, seeping into marrow, a cold that carried voices with it. I heard whispers rising from somewhere beneath, a chorus of tones that overlapped and echoed, all murmuring the same refrain. "Come with us. Come with us. It is time." I gasped, my body jerking, but her grip tightened, stronger than flesh should allow. Her face hovered close to mine, her eyes no longer soft but bright, almost blazing, and she said, "The appointment is tonight." The room shuddered as if her words had weight, the shadows thickening against the walls, the moonlight paling until it was nothing at all. For a moment I thought the floor beneath me had vanished, that my bed had been swallowed by the same endless staircase I had walked in dreams. The air thinned, my breath clawing at itself, and I felt the world tilt, pulling me toward her. My mother burst through the door. Her voice broke the air like thunder, the old language spilling from her lips in jagged rhythms, her hand clutching the same candle she had used in the field. Its flame flared unnaturally bright, a sudden column of light that cut through the shadows. Lily recoiled, her form wavering, her grip loosening just enough for me to gasp in air. But even as she faded, her laughter curled around us, soft and triumphant. "You cannot stop this," she said, her figure blurring as if dissolved by the light. "He promised me, and promises are never broken." With those words, she was gone, leaving the scent of lilies thick and cloying in the air, heavy enough to make me cough. The candle sputtered, its flame guttering low, and my mother dropped to her knees, her face drained of all strength. I sat trembling, the echo of Lily's hand still burning against my skin, my heart pounding with the truth I could no longer deny. The appointment was real, and it was coming. After that night, when Lily's hand had closed over mine and my mother had forced her back with the last of her strength, nothing in the house was the same. My mother moved through the rooms as though she were walking inside a dream herself, her lips always moving with words too faint to catch, her hands trembling as she lit candles in corners and scattered herbs across thresholds. When I tried to speak to her, she would only shake her head and whisper, "You don't understand. She's already too close." I could feel it too. Not in the way she did, not through ritual or prayer, but in the hollow ache that followed me everywhere. I woke each morning with the taste of lilies in my mouth, as though I had been chewing their petals in sleep, and my reflection in the mirror looked dimmer, less anchored, my eyes carrying shadows that didn't belong to me. The townspeople noticed. They didn't say it outright, but I heard the whispers when I passed, their voices dropping low, their eyes sliding away. Some said I looked pale, others said I seemed thinner, others still muttered words like marked and chosen. At night, I sometimes saw them gathered outside the church steps, talking quickly in half sentences, casting glances toward my house as though it had become a doorway no one wished to open. One evening, when I walked through the square, an old man who had known me since childhood caught my sleeve. His grip was weak but insistent, his eyes searching my face with a sorrow I couldn't bear to hold. "Son," he said, "you must leave this place. Whatever you brought back with you, it will take root here. Better it takes you alone than all of us with you." I tried to answer, but the words dried in my throat. I wanted to say I had not brought her, that she had found me, that she had been waiting long before I ever dreamed her name. But what good would it do? The old man already knew. They all did. My mother grew thinner, her hair loosening in strands, her voice fraying with exhaustion. She begged me not to sleep, begged me to stay awake through the long hours of the night while she sat beside me whispering prayers. But no matter how fiercely I fought, sleep always found me, and in sleep, she always waited. Lily no longer appeared in half-formed landscapes. Now she came in places I knew, places from my waking life, the kitchen table where I had once eaten breakfast, the churchyard where I had played as a boy, the square where neighbors once smiled at me. She stood there as though she belonged, smiling with that patience that had turned into triumph, speaking words I could not forget no matter how I tried. "You are closer now. Soon you won't wake at all. Soon you'll be with me." I woke each time with her voice still wrapped around me like a veil, her scent clinging to my skin, her promise echoing as if it had been carved into my bones. My body betrayed me. I felt myself slipping, not in ways anyone could measure, but in ways I could not deny. The warmth of sunlight on my skin seemed thinner, less real. Food lost its taste, water its coolness, the air its weight. When I pressed my palm against the table, I sometimes felt nothing at all, as though the wood had become smoke. One night I walked through the town and realized no one turned their head as I passed. No greetings, no nods, no recognition. It was as if my footsteps fell in silence, as if I were already a ghost. I touched a man's shoulder as he stood by the well, but he did not flinch, did not move, did not even glance back. My hand passed through him as though I had been made of mist. I staggered home in terror, my chest tightening, and when I told my mother, she wept not with surprise, but with the grief of someone who had been waiting for the moment to arrive. "You don't belong fully here anymore," she whispered, clutching my face in her hands. "She's taking pieces of you, one by one. Soon there will be nothing left for me to hold." Her words rang true. Each day I felt the pull stronger, a tug not outward but inward, as if a thread ran from my heart into some other place, and with every breath it was reeled tighter. Lily's voice filled the spaces between my thoughts, reminding me of the promise I had once made, a promise I could not remember but which bound me all the same. I began to fear not only sleep but waking, for in waking I felt the world slip further from me, the veil thinning, the air parting to reveal her shadow close behind. The village grew restless. People muttered of curses, of bargains made generations before, of spirits that walked not in night but in memory. Some urged my mother to send me away. Others urged her to give me over to the church, to let the priest attempt rites stronger than her own. But she clung to me, frail though she had become, her hands shaking as she swore she would not let me go. Yet I knew, and she knew, that my body was already slipping beyond her reach. One night, lying in bed, I felt a change. Not a visitation, not a dream, but a shift so deep it hollowed the room around me. The air thinned, my heart slowed, and in the silence I realized I could no longer feel the beat of my pulse. I stared at my wrist, at the faint blue lines beneath the skin, and though my chest rose and fell, I wondered if breath had already abandoned me. Then I heard her. Not from the corners of a dream, not from the edges of thought, but here, close, as though she were leaning against the wall, whispering through the wood. "It's almost time," Lily said. "Soon you'll step across. Soon we'll keep our appointment." I tried to rise, but the strength left my body. I tried to call for my mother, but my voice broke into silence. All I could do was lie there, the scent of lilies thick in the air, my eyes wide as the room around me dimmed. And I knew with a certainty deeper than fear that I was no longer fully alive, no longer fully dead, but caught in the space between, where she waited, where she had always waited. And I wondered, as the silence pressed in, whether the town was right to fear me, for if Lily had claimed me, then perhaps I was already hers. Perhaps I had never truly come back home at all. The years that followed blurred into something both ordinary and unreal, like living in a house where the walls shift ever so slightly each night so that when you wake, nothing feels quite where it should be. I survived, or at least my body continued to move through the motions of living, but the hollowness never left me. People in town eventually stopped whispering when I passed, though their eyes still lingered too long, as if checking whether I cast a shadow. My mother grew frailer with each season, her prayers thinning into silence, until one day she was gone, leaving me with the echo of her voice and the smell of herbs clinging to old wood. I tried to bury myself in the routines she had once kept, tending the small garden, mending fences, sweeping dust that always seemed to return, but beneath it all the same question haunted me. Why had Lily released me that night? Why had the appointment not yet come due? Sometimes I convinced myself that perhaps the rituals had worked after all, that she had been driven back into the dark. But in the long hours of the night, when the house creaked and the world fell quiet, I would hear her laughter at the edge of hearing, soft as a breath, reminding me that debts never vanish, they only wait. Time slipped, as it does, and I learned to walk with the weight of something unfinished pressing on me. I left the town for a while, drifting from one place to another, always seeking distance, always hoping the farther I moved, the fainter her voice would grow. Yet no matter where I went, the same dreams returned. The endless bridge, the spiraling staircase, the fields that bent without wind. And always, at the end of the dream, she stood waiting with that same patient smile, her eyes carrying the certainty of one who knows how a story ends even when the teller has forgotten. "Don't forget," she whispered again and again. "Our appointment is not broken. It is only delayed." It was many years later, after I had tried to build a life of work and quiet, that the package arrived. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. A box worn soft at the edges, my name scrawled across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address, only a faint scent of damp earth and paper that seemed older than the cardboard itself. I should have ignored it. I should have thrown it into the fire without opening it. But something in me knew before I touched the lid that whatever it contained had already been waiting for me. Inside was a book, a diary. Its leather was cracked, its pages yellowed and frayed at the corners. On the inside cover, written in a looping hand that trembled with youth, was a single name, Lily. My breath caught in my throat. I sat at the table with the diary open before me, the afternoon light slanting across the room, dust drifting like slow rain. Each page was filled with her voice, her thoughts caught in the fragile lines of ink, her words describing the simple days of a girl long gone, walking through fields, singing to herself in empty rooms, longing for something unnamed. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Shadows crept into her words, mentions of dreams she could not explain, whispers she heard at night, a sense that someone was waiting for her, calling her into another world. And then, near the end, I found a passage that froze my blood. She wrote of a boy. She never named him, but she described him with certainty. She said he came to her in dreams, that they spoke for hours, that he promised her something, though she could not put it into words when she woke. She said he had kind eyes, that he felt both close and impossibly far, that she trusted him, though she did not know why. The date on that entry was the week before she disappeared. I kept turning pages, my hands trembling, until I reached the very last. The ink there was darker, fresher, the strokes firm, written not in the looping script of a girl but in lines I recognized with a sick certainty. It was my own handwriting. The words sprawled across the page read, "Today I met someone who can bring me home. He promised me. He said he would help me." My signature trailed beneath it, a flourish I could not deny, a mark I had used all my life. The room swayed. I pushed the book away as though it might burn me, but its weight remained, pressing against the air, pressing against my chest. How could it be? How could my hand have written words in a diary that existed years before I was born, unless the boundary had never held, unless our meetings had not been dreams but exchanges across time, binding us together in ways neither of us had chosen? I heard her then, as clearly as if she had been standing just behind me. "You see," Lily whispered, her voice soft, triumphant, patient as ever. "I never forget, and neither do you. Our appointment isn't finished." The scent of lilies swelled in the room, sweet and suffocating. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the last page, watching the letters of my own hand blur in my vision. Perhaps hours, perhaps only minutes. What I do know is that the silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with her presence, with the weight of the promise I could no longer deny. And I think of you, listening now, tracing each word, following me into this story. You know her name. You know the promise. And once you know, she knows you. The third presence. It had been 10 years since the night we all walked out of the university gates with caps in hand and dreams in our pockets. 10 years since laughter spilled out of crowded bars and promises of staying in touch drifted into the early morning air. 10 years since the accident none of us could fully explain. We gathered again in a small restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place chosen not for glamour but for familiarity, where the light was dim, the chairs mismatched, and the smell of old wood mixed with the faint trace of wine. There were 6 of us that evening, old friends who had once believed the world would bend to our ambition. Time had softened our edges, grayed our temples, scattered us across cities and careers. Yet, as we sat around the table, it was as if no years had passed at all. Stories tumbled out, marriages, children, jobs gained and lost, and laughter filled the air like it had once filled the campus. But beneath the laughter was something else, a silence that waited, a memory that all of us carried but none had spoken of for years. Mark. He should have been there with us, raising a glass, his careful smile easing the tension when others grew too loud, his voice steady with that patience that had always set him apart. But Mark had never lived past that night, the night of our graduation, when he stepped off the curb at a crossing and into the path of a truck whose horn came too late. The sound had echoed through us, then the screech of brakes, the shatter of glass, the scream that broke the air, and even now, 10 years later, it lingered like a bruise we pretended not to press. None of us could reconcile it. Mark had been the cautious one, the careful one, the man who always checked both ways twice, who lectured us when we were careless, who waited for the light, even on empty streets. For him to step out like that, without hesitation, felt wrong in a way that gnawed at us, unspoken but ever present. It was Dave who finally broke the silence. He had been quieter than the rest that night, his glass untouched, his eyes shadowed in a way I had noticed even before he spoke. The conversation had drifted into pauses, and in that pause he cleared his throat, his voice rough as though unused to carrying words. "You ever wonder," he began slowly, "why it had to be him?" The table stilled. No one answered, but the weight of our silence was heavy with agreement. Dave looked down at his hands, then back at us, his eyes darker than I remembered. "I never told anyone. Not then, not after. But I think you should know." The restaurant seemed to lean closer, the hum of conversation from other tables dimming, the clink of glasses falling away, until there was only Dave's voice and the echo of our own breathing. That night, when we were waiting for the light to change, I saw something. Not the truck, not the traffic, something else. He paused, his jaw tightening, and for a moment I thought he would stop. But then the words came, slow and deliberate, each one pulling us deeper. I saw someone on his back. At first I thought it was just the way the shadows fell. But no, it was a shape, a figure, clinging to him like it had always been there, crouched over his shoulders, blacker than the night around us, like smoke pressed into the shape of a body. And as the light shifted, it lifted its head and turned toward me. Dave's voice faltered, but his eyes never left Urs. It smiled. The table was silent. My chest tightened as his words settled into me, the image forming whether I wanted it to or not. A figure hunched on Mark's shoulders, faceless yet grinning, clinging to him as though guiding his every step. I tried to call out, Dave continued, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. I tried to warn him, but the words stuck in my throat. And then Mark moved. He didn't even look at the light. He just stepped forward, like he'd been pushed. And the truck. He closed his eyes. The memory did not need finishing. When he opened them again, there was something in his gaze that made me shiver. The worst part wasn't that it smiled. The worst part was that when it looked at me, I knew it had been waiting, and I knew it had seen me too. No one spoke after that. The clink of cutlery from the other side of the restaurant sounded suddenly far away, muffled by the silence that had taken hold of us. 10 years of unasked questions had found their answer, but it was an answer that carried no comfort. We sat together in that dim room, the candles burning low, each of us staring at our glasses, our reflections fractured in the red wine, and I think we all felt the same thing, the sense that Mark had not simply stumbled, that his death had not been chance. Something had claimed him, something had chosen, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw fear in Dave's eyes, not for what he had seen that night, but for the fact that by speaking it aloud, he had carried it to us. For a long moment after Dave spoke, the table remained in silence. The hum of the restaurant returned slowly, plates clattering, a burst of laughter from a corner booth, the scrape of a chair across the floor. But around us it was as if a glass dome had lowered, muting the world beyond our circle. No one wanted to be the first to speak, because to speak would be to acknowledge that his words had planted something in us, something none of us wanted to carry. Finally, it was Sarah who broke the stillness. She had always been the practical one, the one who scoffed at ghost stories in our dorms, the one who kept us grounded when the rest of us drifted into foolishness. She forced a thin smile and shook her head. Dave, you know how it was that night. We'd been drinking, the streets were crowded, there were lights everywhere. Shadows do strange things when you're tired. Maybe what you saw, but Dave cut her off, his voice sharp, trembling at the edges. No, it wasn't a shadow. I know what I saw. It was real. It was on him, clinging like it had always been there. And when it turned to me, he stopped, swallowed hard, and then said in a voice so low we had to lean in to catch it. When it turned to me, it smiled like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me all along. A shiver ran through me, though the room was warm, and I wasn't the only one. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, running a hand over the back of his neck, as though brushing off an unseen weight. Clara's eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating how quickly she could leave. Even Sarah's composure cracked, her forced smile fading as Dave's words settled into the space between us. You're saying, Michael began slowly, that it, what, chose him? That it was riding him until the right moment? Dave's eyes met his, steady now, stripped of hesitation. Yes, and when it looked at me, I knew it could just as easily have been me instead of Mark. Maybe it was meant to be me. Maybe it decided he was the easier one to take. But the way it smiled, his gaze dropped to the table, his voice dropping lower still. The way it smiled, I knew I wasn't safe. Not then. Not now. The air around us thickened, conversation from other tables receding again until all I could hear was the faint buzz of the ceiling light and the uneven rhythm of our breathing. I wanted to say something, anything, to pull us back into laughter, into safety, but the words stuck, heavy and useless. Clara whispered, almost to herself. I keep thinking about how careful he was. Mark. He never crossed until the light turned green. That night, it hadn't yet. He just stepped forward like someone pushed him. Sarah shook her head again, but her voice lacked conviction. Accidents happen. People panic. Maybe. Dave slammed his hand against the table. Not in anger, but in desperation. It wasn't panic. It wasn't an accident. It smiled. You don't understand. It smiled at me, as if it was showing me what it could do. As if it was saying, this time him, next time you. The image rooted itself in my mind despite every effort to push it away. A shape crouched over Mark's back, faceless yet grinning, turning its head slowly, deliberately, toward Dave, letting him see what no one else could. I imagined standing there myself, watching that grin stretch wider, knowing with a certainty beyond reason that it was aware of me, that it could reach for me whenever it chose. Michael muttered, "Christ," under his breath, and for once no one scolded him for it. The candles on our table flickered then, a draft passing through the room, though no one had opened a door or window. I felt the fine hairs on my arms rise, an involuntary reaction to something unseen, and I knew I wasn't the only one who noticed. We tried to steer the conversation elsewhere after that. Sarah brought up work. Clara mentioned her children. Michael asked about a mutual friend who hadn't come, but each attempt stumbled and fell. Our laughter sounded hollow, our stories half finished, and always the silence returned to settle heavily between us. And Dave sat there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the space just beyond our table as though he were still standing at that crosswalk, still seeing the figure clinging to Mark's back, still remembering the smile meant for him. When the check arrived, none of us touched it at first. We lingered, glasses empty, food cold, each of us reluctant to break the circle, because breaking it would mean walking back into the night alone, carrying the weight of what had been said. Finally, Dave spoke again, his voice little more than a murmur. "You think time keeps you safe. You think distance does. But when something like that sees you, when it smiles at you, it never forgets. It waits. It follows." No one argued with him this time. We left the restaurant together, stepping into the cool night air, our breath visible in faint wisps. The street was quiet, the lamps glowing dull yellow, the crosswalk at the end of the block glowing red. None of us moved until it turned green, and as we crossed, I could not help but glance at the shoulders of my friends, at the empty space above their backs, half expecting to see something crouched there, waiting. I saw nothing, but the memory of Dave's words, the image of that smile, clung to me long after we had gone our separate ways. For a few nights after the reunion, I tried to convince myself that Dave's story had been nothing more than the invention of a tired mind weighed down by grief, a vision spun by the shock of headlights and the chaos of that night 10 years ago. Yet the truth was less forgiving. His words had settled into each of us, not as a memory but as a seed, and it began to grow in ways none of us could stop. It was Clara who called first. She spoke quickly, her voice tight, saying that ever since the dinner she had been waking at night to the sound of footsteps in the hall outside her bedroom. She lived alone. When she turned on the light, the hall was always empty, but she swore she felt the pressure of someone standing just behind her shoulder. Then Michael admitted that twice, while shaving in the bathroom mirror, he caught sight of something in the reflection, a figure crouched low, clinging to his back. Each time he spun around, nothing was there, but his reflection showed the shape still clinging, its face pressed against his shoulder as though it were hiding. Sarah dismissed it all at first, but even she cracked when she confessed she had stopped driving alone at night. "I keep checking the rear view," she whispered, "and I swear sometimes I see teeth in the dark." We agreed to meet again, not for celebration this time, but because none of us wanted to carry the weight alone. The same restaurant, the same corner table, as if returning to the scene might help us unravel what had begun to follow us. The moment I walked in, I knew it would not. The air was heavy, thicker than before, and though the lights burned the same and the staff greeted us with the same polite nods, there was a tension at our table that had nothing to do with food or wine. We sat close, our voices low, each of us speaking quickly, urgently, recounting the moments we had felt watched, the glimpses we had caught, the whispers that brushed against our ears when no one was near. Dave said little. He only listened, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the flicker of the candle between us. When at last he spoke, it was with the certainty of someone who no longer doubted his own nightmare. "It's not just me anymore," he said. "Now you've seen it too." The words hung there like smoke, and in that moment the restaurant seemed to fall silent around us. The laughter from other tables dimmed, the clatter of dishes muffled, as though the world had taken a step back to leave us alone with what we had summoned. Then the light above our table flickered. Once, twice, we all looked up, and when our eyes dropped back to the table, the candle between us bent sideways, its flame guttering though no draft stirred. And then I saw it. Not in the corner of my vision, not in a reflection, but clearly, directly, as if it had decided to stop hiding. A shape crouched between us, perched on the edge of the table like a spider, its limbs too long, its back arched, its head cocked in silent amusement. The light from the candle caught its face, or what should have been a face, and revealed a grin stretched impossibly wide, teeth sharp, glistening, eyes hollow but aware. I couldn't breathe. Neither could the others. Clara's hand shot to her mouth. Sarah pushed back in her chair until it nearly toppled. Michael swore under his breath, and still the thing remained, balanced in the center of us as though it had been there all along, waiting for the moment we would finally see it together. Dave's face was ashen, his lips trembling. "That's it," he whispered. "That's what smiled at me that night." The figure shifted then, its body turning slowly, deliberately, so that its empty sockets moved from one of us to the next, studying us, savoring us. When its gaze passed over me, I felt my stomach twist, my lungs tighten, as if the weight of that grin pressed into my chest. It leaned closer to Dave, its teeth bared in what might have been laughter, though no sound came. Dave flinched but did not move, his body rigid with the terror of recognition. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The candle flame straightened, the light above steadied. The restaurant's noise rushed back in as if nothing had shifted at all. But it had. We all sat frozen, our breaths shallow, our eyes locked on one another in silent confirmation. We had seen it, all of us. The third presence was no longer a secret carried by Dave alone. It was real, and it had chosen to reveal itself, not in fragments or illusions, but fully, undeniably, at our table. No one dared speak for several minutes. The clatter of dishes, the laughter from nearby tables, the hum of the air conditioner, all of it sounded obscene, too ordinary in contrast with what we had just witnessed. Finally, Clara whispered, her voice cracked and small. "It's with us now, isn't it?" No one answered, but in the silence, we all knew she was right. We left the restaurant together that night, but there was no laughter, no warmth in our goodbyes. Each of us walked quickly into the dark, our eyes darting to our own shoulders, our own reflections in shop windows, the corners of alleys where shadows pooled too deep. And though I told myself over and over that I had seen nothing more than a trick of light and fear, the memory of that grin would not fade. It clung to me like the echo of Dave's words, like the weight of something crouched low, waiting for the moment to be seen again. The night air outside the restaurant felt colder than it should have, a damp chill that slid beneath our coats and settled into the skin. We stood for a moment on the pavement, clustered together as though proximity alone could ward off what we had seen, the warm glow from the windows spilling behind us like a memory of safety already fading. None of us wanted to be the first to leave, but neither did we want to linger. The street stretched quiet in both directions, the lamplight falling in dim, fractured pools, and for the first time I noticed how easily shadows slipped between them. Clara broke the silence with a quick goodbye, her voice too loud, too brittle, as though speaking faster would prevent the night from answering back. She walked briskly down the street, her heels striking sharp echoes against the pavement, and with each step she seemed to draw farther, not just in distance but in courage, as though the only choice left was to outrun whatever might linger. Michael muttered something about his car and went the opposite way, his shoulders hunched, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Sarah stayed a moment longer, exchanging a look with Dave, but even she turned quickly, pulling her scarf higher around her neck, her eyes fixed forward. Soon it was only Dave and I left, the glow from the restaurant door behind us shrinking as it closed, sealing the warmth and laughter of strangers inside. We walked together in silence. The city was not empty. Cars passed now and then, headlights sweeping across the street, and somewhere distant a dog barked, but there was a strange emptiness in it all, as if every sound and every light was muffled beneath something larger, something pressing down from above. I caught myself glancing at Dave's shoulders more than once, searching for the outline of a crouched figure. Nothing, but absence brought no comfort. The memory of what we had seen on the table still gnawed at the edges of my vision, as though it might step into view again at any moment. Dave's voice finally broke the silence, low and strained. "You felt it too, didn't you?" The way it looked at each of us, like it was choosing. I nodded, though the gesture felt useless in the dark. It was real. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I used to wonder if I was losing my mind. Now I wonder if all of us are." When we parted ways at the corner, I lingered beneath the street lamp until he was gone from sight. The pool of light around me felt fragile, shallow, unable to hold back the dark that pressed in on all sides. For a moment I thought I heard footsteps echoing mine, though I had not moved. I told myself it was nothing, only the hum of the lamp, the hiss of a distant tire on wet asphalt. But when I finally turned toward home, the certainty remained. Something had followed us out of that restaurant. That night, sleep was impossible. The room seemed too small, the shadows too deep, and each time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of something pressing against my chest, as though crouched above me, smiling. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but it was no true rest. In my dreams, I was back at the table, the candle guttering, the figure leaning forward. Except this time it did not vanish. It crawled across the table, over the glasses, over the plates, its grin widening as it drew closer, and when it reached me, it whispered a soundless laugh into my ear. I woke with a start, the echo of that laugh vibrating inside my skull, and for a moment I swore I could still feel its breath on my skin. Over the following days, the messages began. Clara wrote first, saying she had seen it in her living room mirror, standing behind her reflection, though the space behind her was empty. Michael called late one night, his voice shaking, telling me he had felt hands pressing against his shoulders as he sat alone at his desk. Even Sarah, who had resisted belief longer than the rest, admitted she had found footprints on the frost outside her window, small and sharp, leading up to the glass and then disappearing. And Dave said little, but his silence spoke louder than words. He stopped answering his phone, stopped replying to messages. When I finally went to his apartment, the curtains were drawn, the lights dim, and he looked thinner, hollowed, as though the weight of being watched had eaten away at him. "It's not staying hidden anymore," he whispered when I pressed him. "It doesn't need to. Once it's seen, once it smiles at you, it belongs to you. Or maybe you belong to it." The realization spread among us like rot. The thing had not been left behind in the restaurant. It had crossed the threshold with us, seeped into our reflections, our footsteps, our breathing. It was not bound to a place, but to people, to the ones who had looked upon it and known it for what it was. Every time I walked down a street, I found myself glancing into shop windows, half expecting to see its crouched figure clinging to my back in the reflection. Every time I waited at a crosswalk, I remembered Mark, and the way Dave had said it had smiled. At night I kept the lights on, but the glow only deepened the shadows, made them thicker, more suggestive, until I could not tell where the walls ended and the waiting began. And always, beneath everything, was the memory of that grin, not fading but growing sharper, more certain, as though it had followed me beyond the night, beyond the restaurant, beyond the fragile safety of the group. The others tried to dismiss it again, to explain it away as stress, as imagination, but the explanations faltered each time one of us saw it anew. Each time the grin returned in glass, in shadow, in the edge of vision. We had carried it with us, we had invited it out, and now it walked in the world with us, no longer confined to a single moment or a single death. The weeks after that second gathering blurred into one long stretch of unease, each day marked not by hours or tasks, but by the small intrusions of the thing that had followed us. Clara spoke of whispers when she tried to read bedtime stories to her children, words she could not decipher, but which seemed to weave themselves between her own. Michael stopped shaving altogether, unable to face the mirror, his beard growing uneven and wild. Sarah kept moving between hotels, never sleeping in the same place 2 nights in a row, convinced that changing her surroundings might shake it loose. None of it helped. And Dave had retreated completely. When I went to see him again, his apartment was dark, curtains shut tight, the air stale as though days had passed without breath or light. He opened the door only a crack, enough for me to see the hollow in his eyes, the way his skin clung too closely to the bone. He whispered one sentence before closing the door again. "It's not just us anymore." At first, I didn't understand. I thought he meant that the thing had spread among the people around us, our families, our co-workers, anyone unlucky enough to brush against our shadows. But then I began to notice something else, something stranger. At the cafe near my office, a barista looked at me too long when handing over my cup, her smile faltering as if she'd seen something behind me. On the bus, a man shifted seats suddenly, glancing over his shoulder with unease before refusing to meet my eyes again. Once, walking home late, A child on the opposite pavement pointed at me and tugged at his mother's hand, whispering a word I couldn't hear. She dragged him away, her face pale. It was then I understood. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing it. The night the truth crystallized was quiet, windless, the kind of night where every sound seems magnified by silence. I was lying in bed, the lamp still on, the book on my chest unread, when I felt it. Not a sound, not a touch, but a pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. I turned my head slowly, and in the reflection of the darkened window I saw it. It crouched just behind me, its grin stretched impossibly wide, its eyes hollow yet focused, its body pressed close as if it had been waiting all along. I did not scream. I could not. My throat locked, my breath shallow, and in that suspended moment it leaned closer. Its lips did not move, yet I felt the words, not spoken but poured directly into my mind. You see me? So I see you. The grin widened, impossibly, until it seemed to split the face in two. And then the lamp flickered, and it was gone. The next morning, I called Dave. No answer. I tried again, and again. By evening, I went to his apartment, but the door was unlocked, the rooms empty, the curtains still drawn, the bed unmade, the silence heavy. On the desk lay a single scrap of paper, scrawled in his uneven handwriting. It doesn't stop with us. It doesn't stop at all. Anyone who knows becomes part of it. That was the last trace of him. Now, when I walk down the street, I see it in the faces of strangers, the flicker of recognition, the way their eyes catch on something just over my shoulder before they quickly look away. I hear it in conversations, fragments of stories passed in whispers, words like shadow and smile spoken by people I have never met. It is spreading, not bound to us alone, but to anyone who listens, anyone who dares to let the image of it take root. It doesn't need to be seen in the flesh. To know of it is enough. To imagine it is to invite it, and once invited, it does not leave. That is why I tell you this now, in this voice, in this moment, because you have heard it too. You have pictured it crouched low, its long limbs bent, its grin sharp and waiting. You have felt the brush of its presence in the dark, even if only for the length of this story. And if you are very quiet, if you let the silence of the night settle, you may notice what we did. The flicker of a light that should have held steady, the faint weight at your shoulder though nothing rests there, the sense that something behind you is leaning closer, smiling, because now you know, and once you know, it knows you. The secret beneath the cement. In small towns, the houses carry stories more stubbornly than the people do. The paint peels, the wood rots, the shutters rattle, but what lingers beneath is older than nails or bricks. When Mr. Border, too airy, and Mrs. Holloway moved into the house at the edge of town, everyone whispered that it had been left empty too long, that there was a reason the price was so low, that sometimes silence itself is a warning. But they were old now, their savings thin, and a roof was a roof. They took the bargain, and with it, the weight of all the years the house had spent watching. The first nights were quiet enough, filled with the comfort of routine, kettle hissing on the stove, creak of floorboards under slow footsteps, the lull of wind in the shutters. But then the dreams began. They came not with thunder, not with screams, but with a presence. Each night, as the Holloways slept, they felt the shift in the air, the cold at the foot of the bed. And when they opened their eyes, whether in the dream or in truth, they could not say there stood a man, tall, gray around the edges, neither old nor young, neither stranger nor familiar. He did not move closer. He did not vanish when the light flickered. He only stood, pointing at the floor with one hand and whispering in a voice that belonged to no time at all, "This is mine. This is my house." At first, they told each other it was nothing more than imagination, the tricks of aging minds. But the dreams repeated, the words always the same, the figure always rooted to the same spot at the end of the bed. By the third night, Mrs. Holloway could describe the tilt of his head, the shadow of his collar, the way his eyes did not blink. By the fifth night, Mr. Holloway admitted that he had heard the whisper not only in the dream but in the stillness of the morning as he rose to make tea. It was not the kind of haunting that drove people screaming into the street. It was quieter than that, more patient. The figure asked for nothing, demanded nothing, except to be acknowledged. Then, one morning, Mr. Holloway did not wake. His heart had slowed in the night, his breath had stilled, and when Mrs. Holloway reached across the bed, the man at the foot was gone. The funeral was small. The town nodded in pity, and though they offered help, she refused. She packed what little she had and left the house without looking back. Her son, Thomas, arrived to collect what was left. He was an architect, practical, skeptical, a man of structures and measurements, not stories. He listened politely as his mother recounted the dreams, the figure, the whisper, but he smiled with the tight patience of someone humoring a child. Ghosts were for books and films. Houses were brick and timber, nothing more. And so, while she left, he stayed. The first night alone in the house, Thomas slept easily, as if the walls themselves bent to his disbelief. But dreams do not yield to denial. Sometime past midnight he woke, or thought he woke, to the sound of breath not his own. At the end of the bed, in the shadow where the moonlight bent, stood the man his mother had described. The figure did not waver, did not speak at first, until Thomas, with the unshaken boldness of a man unwilling to surrender to superstition, whispered, "What do you want?" And then the answer came, soft and sure, the same words his parents had heard. "This is mine. This is my house." Thomas sat up, his body rigid, his hands clenched in the sheets, but the figure did not move closer. It only pointed downward, one finger toward the floor, and its mouth curved into something too sharp to be a smile. When the morning came, the figure was gone, but Thomas, unlike his parents, did not take it as fear. He took it as a puzzle. He began to dig, not with shovels at first, but with questions. He traced the deed, the old maps, the town records, and there, buried in paperwork as in soil, he found the first clue. Long before the Holloways, before the fresh paint and the neat hedges, the land had belonged to a slaughterhouse, a place where screams and blood were part of the daily rhythm, where floors were scrubbed but never clean. Thomas felt a spark of vindication. It was not a ghost, not a curse, only memory. Houses absorb what they are made to hold, and this one had absorbed too much death. But the dreams continued. The man returned, night after night, always at the foot of the bed, always pointing down. And Thomas, unwilling to surrender to what he could not explain, brought tools. One evening, he moved aside the rug in the center of the room, where the man's finger seemed to hover most insistently. He struck the cement floor with his hammer. The sound was dull, uneven. Beneath the gray surface was not soil, not stone, but something hollow. Hours passed. Sweat dampened his shirt. Dust clouded the room, until at last the hammer broke through, revealing a cavity beneath. The smell that rose was not fresh decay, but something older, heavier, the kind of scent that clings to the back of the throat. And there, beneath the cement, lay a shape. Bones curled where flesh once was, a skull half collapsed, ribs bent inward as though crushed, a body, hidden, sealed away under years of silence. Thomas stared down into the dark, his chest heaving, the air thick with the dust of what should have remained buried. He told himself he was not afraid, only curious, only determined to uncover the truth. But when he looked up, the figure was standing closer now, its lips finally moving in something beyond a whisper. "You see me. You see what they did." The candle on the dresser sputtered, the room dimmed, and for the first time Thomas wondered if his disbelief had not protected him, but invited something far older, far hungrier, into his sight. Thomas told himself he was a rational man. Rational men did not tremble at shadows. They did not let dreams dictate their waking hours, and they did not believe in figures that whispered at the foot of a bed. So when the bones lay revealed beneath the cement, curled and broken, he did what any practical man would do. He called the authorities. The officers arrived at dusk, their car headlights cutting across the small front lawn. They carried with them the smell of coffee and rain-wet jackets, the routine weariness of men who had seen too many accidents and too much blood. But when they entered the house and saw the cavity in the floor, the hollow space filled with the remnants of a body, their voices dropped, their faces tightened. They spoke in low tones as though not to wake something that had been left sleeping too long. One officer, younger than the rest, tried to make light of it, muttering something about old houses and hidden histories, but his words hung flat in the air, and when he bent to lift the bones into a bag, his hands shook. The skull rolled slightly, its hollow sockets catching the glow of the flashlight, and the young officer swore under his breath. The remains were taken away that night. Thomas watched as they zipped the bag closed, the sound of the teeth locking together sharp, final, like a door slammed on a secret too long kept. He felt a strange relief as the van pulled away. It was over, he told himself. The dead would be given their due. A few days later, the town gathered for a small service. The minister spoke of rest, of peace, of returning dust to dust. The words drifted into the cold air, but no one seemed certain who they were burying. No name was given. No family claimed the body. The grave was marked with nothing but the date of discovery, a blank stone standing at the edge of the cemetery like a question carved into earth. Thomas stood apart from the crowd, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed not on the coffin but on the people around him. He noticed how often they glanced toward him, how quickly their eyes moved away. It was as if, by unearthing the body, he had unearthed something else, an unease in the town itself, a memory they did not want stirred. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without dreams. No whisper at the foot of the bed, no figure pointing to the floor. The silence was deep, almost kind, and he told himself it was proof that he had done the right thing. The house was his now, not haunted, only old, but silence is its own kind of warning. On the second night, he woke to a sound, not the whisper he had come to expect, but a knocking, slow, deliberate, steady. It came from beneath the new patch of cement, where the cavity had been sealed. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 more. Thomas sat up, his breath held, his ears straining. The house was still, the wind outside calm, yet the sound continued, muffled but certain, as though a hand pressed from below. He rose, every step toward the center of the room weighted with dread, and placed his palm flat against the cool cement. The knock stopped, and then a whisper, faint but unmistakable, bloomed against his skin. "You see me still?" He staggered back, his hand shaking, his chest tight. The house was empty. He had checked every corner, but the emptiness no longer felt like safety. It felt like expectation, as though the walls themselves leaned closer, listening. The next morning he tried to convince himself it had been a dream, the echo of fear playing tricks on his half-sleeping mind. He worked longer hours at his firm, drew up plans until the lines blurred, surrounded himself with noise and voices. But every time he returned to the house, the silence greeted him like a waiting host. Nights stretched long. The whispers returned not at the foot of the bed now, but closer, beside him, behind him, woven into the air he breathed. Sometimes he caught his reflection in the darkened window, and for a moment he swore another face hovered beside his own, gray and hollow, watching with patient hunger. The townspeople began to talk. At the grocery, he overheard 2 women muttering about how some things were not meant to be dug up. At the hardware store, an old man touched his arm and whispered, "Leave it alone," before shuffling quickly away. It was not just the house that carried secrets. Now, it was him. And Thomas, though he would never admit it aloud, began to feel the truth pressing in. Burying the bones had not ended the haunting. It had only given it a new shape. One night, unable to bear the silence, he spoke into the dark. "What do you want from me?" The answer came immediately, close enough to feel on his skin, though no lips moved. No figure stood at the bed. "You know. You cannot unknow." Sleep became a stranger. His sketches at work grew erratic, his lines jagged, his buildings collapsing under the weight of restless hands. He caught himself doodling strange patterns, circles, crosses, cracks, splitting into branches, shapes that looked less like structures and more like maps of something buried. And always the knocking returned. Some nights faint, some nights louder, as though the cement itself strained to give way. The police had called it closure. The minister had called it peace. But Thomas knew. There had been no closure, no peace. There had only been an exchange. Bones for silence, silence for whispers, whispers for something far older than the house itself. He began to wonder if the man who stood at the foot of the bed had not been asking for release at all, but for recognition. And by digging, by unearthing, by naming the secret aloud, Thomas had given him that. And once something is seen, it does not go back to sleep. Thomas told himself that what he heard each night, the knocking, the whisper, the faint shift of weight against the floorboards, was only in his mind. that if he held still long enough, if he drowned himself in work or in the shallow chatter of townsfolk, it would fade. But the mind does not forget what it has seen, and the body does not lie when it shivers at a sound that should not be there. The knocks grew louder. Not every night, not regular, but enough to keep him from rest. Sometimes they came from beneath the patched cement in the bedroom, sometimes from the hall, sometimes from the kitchen tiles, as if the house itself were hollow, filled with restless hands pressing against the skin of its floors. He tried to ignore them, at first. He placed rugs over the patched places, turned music high, left the lights on, but each trick only seemed to provoke the silence further, and the dreams returned. In them, the man no longer stood at the end of the bed. He crouched closer, pointing not at one place but at many. The whole room seemed to bow beneath his gesture, the floor sagging as though it concealed not a body, but an ocean of them. Thomas woke one morning with his sheets damp from sweat, the imprint of a hand-shaped bruise on his ankle. The bruise faded by evening, but the mark it left in his thoughts did not. He began to believe that the only way forward was the same way he had already begun, to dig. He gathered his tools again, the hammer, the chisel, the crowbar. Late at night, when the town slept, he pulled up the rugs and pressed his ear to the cold cement. Sometimes he swore he could hear breath, faint and muffled, as if someone waited just below. The first strike of the hammer echoed through the empty rooms. Dust rose in small clouds, catching the lamplight. He struck again, and again, until the patch gave way, revealing soil dark and damp beneath. The smell rolled out slowly, not the sharpness of rot, but the heavy, clinging scent of old blood sunk deep into earth. He dug with his hands when the tools slowed him, nails cracking against stone and dirt. Hours passed unnoticed, and then his fingers caught on something solid, curved. He pulled, and a skull slid free, its jaw still faintly attached, teeth gritted as though holding in a scream. Thomas staggered back, the skull tumbling from his hands. But as it struck the floor, it did not roll, it sank slightly, as though the cement beneath it had softened, had accepted it. And in the silence that followed, the knocking began again, not below him, but all around, a chorus rising from every corner of the house. He dug more. He could not stop. Each patch of cement he broke led to more soil, more shapes. Ribs curled like cages, arms twisted as though clawing at the surface. He uncovered one body, then another, until the pattern was undeniable. The house was not built on a grave. The house was the grave. His lamp flickered, shadows crawling along the cracked walls, and in their shifting he saw them, dozens of figures, pale and silent, pressed against the edges of the room. They did not move closer, did not reach for him. They only watched, their hollow eyes wide, their mouths fixed open in soundless protest. And in the center of them, the man from his dreams stood taller than before, no longer pointing, no longer whispering. He lifted his hand, and the walls of the house seemed to groan in response. The sound was not of wood settling, but of voices rising, a low moan threaded with centuries of silence broken. Thomas fell to his knees, dirt under his nails, dust in his throat. His chest heaved, but his eyes did not close. He could not stop looking. The truth was too vast, too terrible, and yet too certain to deny. The next morning, the town awoke to silence from the Holloway house. The curtains were drawn, the door shut, no sound of tools or movement within. But those who passed along the road swore they heard something else, an echo rising from beneath the earth, like a hum too low to name, a vibration that lingered in the soles of their feet. Inside, Thomas stood at the center of the room, surrounded by broken patches of floor, by the mouths of graves he had opened. The bodies waited in their dark soil, the figures pressed against the walls of his vision, and the man at their center whispered only one thing. "You see now. You see us all." And Thomas, hands bloodied from digging, dust clinging to his face, whispered back with a voice that was not entirely his own. Yes, the discovery did not stay hidden for long. Word in small towns never does. One neighbor had heard the hammering in the night. Another had seen Thomas's silhouette through the curtains, stooped and frantic, swinging a tool again and again. When the smell drifted into the street, earth turned sour, damp and heavy. They began to whisper. And within days, the story of the bones beneath the Holloway house was spoken not in quiet corners but in the open. each telling more vivid than the last. At first, the police tried to contain it. They told the town that yes, one skeleton had been found, long buried, perhaps the work of an earlier century when records were scarce. But the explanation thinned too quickly, because Thomas kept digging. And when neighbors glimpsed the stretchers carrying more than one bag from the house, when they counted 3, then 5, then more, the whispers hardened into fear. People gathered in small knots outside the hardware store, in the aisles of the grocery, along the fence lines. They asked each other the same question in different words. How many bodies make a graveyard? And what sort of house is built upon one? The Holloway house became a boundary. Some crossed the street to avoid passing it. Others lingered nearby, drawn to its silence, unable to stop staring at the windows as though something might stare back. Children were warned away but dared each other to run across the lawn, to touch the porch rail, to press their ears against the siding and listen for voices in the walls. And always, Thomas remained inside. When people did see him at the market, walking quickly with dust still clinging to his hair, or at the churchyard standing too long by the fresh graves, they noticed his eyes. He had the look of a man who no longer measured the world in hours or tasks, but in the weight of silence pressing at his back. He answered questions vaguely, his voice distracted, as if he were listening not to the living but to something speaking faintly behind them. In his solitude, Thomas felt it more clearly. The figures did not confine themselves to the bedroom anymore. They drifted through the halls, pale and patient, brushing past him as though testing the walls of a cage newly cracked. At night, when he lay awake, the whispers rose from beneath the floors in unison, not one voice but many, a language older than words, a rhythm of hunger and grief. He began to understand. The man who had first appeared at the end of his parents' bed had not been alone. He had been a herald, a representative of something larger, something collective. By striking through the cement, by opening what had been sealed, Thomas had not freed one spirit but awakened an entire company of them. They did not rest. They did not fade. They multiplied in his sight, filling doorways, crowding the edges of mirrors, pressing their pale hands against the windows as though waiting to be let out. The town's fear swelled into panic. Dogs refused to go near the house, pulling hard on their leashes until their collars strained. Lights in nearby homes flickered without cause. Several families packed in haste and left town altogether, whispering that once a grave is disturbed, the dead do not stay in one place. The minister tried to speak of peace, but his sermons faltered when parishioners swore they saw shadows in the rafters of the church. The police tried to insist there was nothing more than bones, but even they began to shorten their patrols, refusing to linger near the Holloway property after dark. The house became a wound, raw and spreading, and the town recoiled from it. Inside, Thomas could no longer tell if he was digging to find the end of it, or if the act of digging itself kept them awake. Each strike of his hammer seemed to draw another voice, another face, another weight pressing closer. And though he tried to stop, though he dropped the tools and swore never to touch them again, the silence that followed was worse than the knocking. It was not peace, it was waiting. He realized then that the haunting was not in the house alone. It was in him. His hands itched with the memory of soil, his dreams thick with the taste of dust. He could feel them watching through his own eyes, leaning close when he spoke, echoing faintly in the pauses between his words. And the most terrible part was this: he no longer wanted to resist. Standing in the half-lit kitchen one night, dust settling on the counters, Thomas whispered into the stillness, "How many of you are there?" The answer came not as one voice, but as a chorus, layered and endless, rising through the floorboards, vibrating the glass in the windows. Enough, the sound carried into the street. A neighbor swore she heard it while closing her shutters, and by morning the story had run through every corner of town. The Holloway house spoke, not in a single whisper, but in a multitude. By then the town was no longer only afraid of the house. They were afraid of Thomas, afraid of the way he walked with dust on his hands, the way he lingered too long in the cemetery, the way his eyes seemed to focus not on the living but on something standing just over their shoulders. He had become part of the story, and the story had already outgrown him. The cement was broken, the silence undone. And Thomas knew, with the certainty of a man who had stared too long into the hollow of the earth, that he had awakened not one ghost, but an entire graveyard. And graveyards, once awake, do not go back to sleep. The town never forgot the Holloway house, but in time they learned to step around it, to lower their voices when passing, to let the story sink into the soil like every other unspoken memory. They boarded up the windows. They nailed shut the doors. They told themselves that distance was safety, but Thomas did not leave. At first, people saw him still in the yard, bent low, clearing weeds, sweeping dust from the porch as though the house were nothing more than a project that could be completed with enough care. But the closer they looked, the more they saw the change in him. His clothes hung loose. His hands were perpetually dirty. His eyes carried that vacant glaze of someone staring at something no one else could see. The digging did not stop. When the police forced their way inside after too many complaints, they found the floors torn open in every room, the beams cracked, the walls bowing inward. Thomas had split the house apart from the inside, exposing cavities where bones lay stacked, like forgotten archives. Yet when they confronted him, he only smiled faintly, dust clinging to his lips, and said, "You don't understand." They were waiting. After that, he disappeared for stretches of time. Some said he went to other towns, taking contracts for demolition, insisting on handling the foundations himself. Others whispered he had been seen near the old mill, crouched in the rubble with a lantern, pressing his ear to the ground as though listening for voices. And always, where he went, stories followed. A farmhouse outside town where strange drafts whistled through newly broken floors. A schoolhouse abandoned after workmen uncovered bones in the crawlspace. An empty lot where dogs refused to walk, though the soil showed signs of fresh disturbance. It was as if Thomas carried the habit of digging with him, unable to stop his hands from prying into the earth, unable to resist the pull of whatever secrets lay beneath. The few who still spoke to him said his words had changed. He no longer denied what he saw. Instead, he spoke with the certainty of a man who had accepted his role. "There are always layers," he murmured once to a shopkeeper, dust falling from his coat as he counted out coins. "Every town, every street, every house. They bury what they don't want to see, but the ground remembers. And if you listen closely enough, you can hear them knocking, asking to be let out." The shopkeeper told the story with a nervous laugh, but his hands shook when he said it. Years passed, and Thomas grew thinner, paler, his hair streaked with white, though he was not yet old. But the look in his eyes remained fixed, steady, like a man who had glimpsed something vast and could never look away again. They say he no longer stayed in one place. He wandered. Construction sites, condemned buildings, abandoned barns, wherever cement was poured thick, wherever earth was tamped flat, he appeared. Sometimes he brought tools, sometimes only his bare hands, but always when he left, the ground bore marks of disturbance, and people whispered of bones, of artifacts, of things better left unseen. The habit had become his life, or perhaps his curse. One winter evening, a boy walking home from school swore he saw Thomas at the edge of the cemetery. The man was crouched by a headstone, not digging, only pressing his ear to the frozen ground. The boy lingered long enough to hear Thomas whisper softly, as if in answer to something only he could hear, "Yes, I'll find you." By the time the boy blinked, Thomas was gone, leaving only a dark patch of earth where frost had melted in the shape of a handprint. The Holloway house eventually collapsed under its own weight, the beams too weak, the floor too fractured. The town leveled the ruins, spread gravel, put up a fence. But even after it was gone, people swore they still heard the sound of knocking when they walked past at night, muffled but insistent, as though coming from deep beneath their own feet. And Thomas, wherever he had gone, carried that sound with him. Perhaps you will pass through a town one day, far from here, and hear of a man who cannot resist tearing up floorboards, who kneels in dust with his ear to the earth, who digs until his hands bleed. Perhaps you will see the strange look in his eyes, the hunger of someone who no longer digs for truth, but because the truth has claimed him. And if you do, remember this: the bones he finds are never just bones. They are the remnants of voices waiting to be heard, of secrets waiting to be uncovered. And once they are uncovered, they are never buried again. So when you hear knocking at night 3 times, and then 3 more, don't answer. Don't listen too closely, because Thomas is still out there, somewhere, with dirt under his nails and dust on his lips, eager to show you what lies beneath. And once you see it, you will never stop digging either. The residue of the past, Business travel had long ago worn the wonder out of hotels and rental flats for Andrew Hale. To him, rooms were nothing more than boxes to pass through, a bed to collapse on, a desk to scatter papers across, a coffee pot that brewed just enough to keep him moving. He didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. Ghosts belonged to old films, to stories told by children at sleepovers, to the cracks in people's minds when loneliness pressed too hard. That was why, when his company sent him to the small city on the coast and booked him into a building older than it looked, with plaster walls that carried stains like shadows and a brass elevator that groaned with every rise, he felt only mild irritation. The flat was on the 7th floor. Numbered doors lined a dim hallway, carpet worn thin in the center, lights that flickered before they steadied. His was at the far end, a corner apartment with a balcony overlooking streets that were quieter than they should have been for a city that size. The first night passed unremarkably. He unpacked little, as he always did, tossed his tie over the chair, lay down fully clothed, and let exhaustion do the rest. It was the second night when something shifted. He had been walking home late, the street lamps buzzing faintly, the air smelling faintly of sea salt and rust. The sidewalks were empty. Then, without warning, a metallic crash split the silence. He froze. A long bar of iron, thick and heavy, landed just feet from where he stood, striking sparks against the concrete before settling with a clatter that echoed through the street. Andrew spun around, searching the shadows. No scaffolding, no construction, no open windows above. The buildings on either side were shut tight, their facades blank and still. There was no place from which it could have fallen. His heart thudded in his chest, not with fear, but with that sharp indignation of being startled. He nudged the bar with his shoe, half expecting it to vanish like a trick of the mind. It was real, cold, heavy. He left it there and walked on, faster this time, telling himself the city had its ways, that somewhere, someone had left something unsecured. But the back of his neck prickled, and he could not shake the feeling that the sound had been meant for him. Later, in bed, as he hovered between wake and sleep, he heard it, a sigh, not from the pipes, not from the wind through the balcony, but close, too close, a low, tired exhalation that brushed the hair at his ear. He sat up sharply, the room lit only by the street lamp outside. Nothing moved. The sigh did not repeat. He laughed once, hollowly, telling himself it was nothing more than exhaustion bending the edges of his perception. He had traveled too much, slept too little, and the mind invents company when it tires of solitude. Still, he left the lamp on when he finally lay back down. The next day passed without incident. Meetings filled his time, coffee steadied his nerves, and by evening he had almost convinced himself that the bar of metal and the phantom sigh were tricks, coincidences that carried more weight in the dark. That night, however, the weight grew heavier. He shared the apartment with two colleagues, Anna, quiet but sharp, and Mara, who laughed too loudly at her own jokes but was kind in a way that softened Andrew's cynicism. The three of them returned late, ate takeout by the window, and fell asleep in their separate rooms. The building was quiet, the city outside muted. Sometime after midnight, Andrew woke, unable to move. His chest heaved, his eyes darted, but his limbs were pinned as though by an invisible weight. He struggled to call out, to force sound through his throat, and then he realized he wasn't alone. The room was filled with feathers, white and brown, soft and brittle, scattered across the floor and the bed, drifting in the air though no window was open. He stared, unable to move, as more appeared, as though shaken loose from some unseen source. They littered the carpet, the desk, the chair in the corner, and in the corner itself, just for a moment, he thought he saw a figure crouched low, its head bowed, its breath ragged. When at last his body jolted free, the feathers were gone. The room was empty. But in the silence that followed, he heard it again, the long, low sigh, just behind his ear. He did not tell Anna or Mara that morning. Not at first. He watched them pour coffee, watched them gather their files, wondering if either had slept well. It was Mara who spoke first, her voice unsteady. "Did either of you wake up last night? Couldn't move?" Anna's spoon clinked too hard against her cup. "Yes," she said almost in a whisper, "and I saw them too. Feathers, everywhere." The three of them sat in silence, each realizing the experience had not been singular. Whatever haunted the seventh floor was not contained to one room or one dream. It had touched them all. That evening, Andrew began to ask questions. The landlord shrugged, said the building was old. The walls carried drafts. The floors creaked. But one cleaner, an older woman with eyes that had seen too much, lowered her voice and muttered that the seventh floor had once been used for something else. A gathering place, she said. Not for prayers exactly, but for rituals. People had come in secret, leaving offerings, scattering feathers as part of ceremonies no one understood. Most tenants never stayed long, she added, shaking her head. They always left. Some things cling, some energies do not dissipate. Andrew smiled politely, dismissing her words aloud. But inside, he felt the memory of the sigh curl tight in his chest. Andrew had never been a man given to superstition. Yet after that night, the ordinary comforts of skepticism no longer carried their familiar weight. And as he moved through the city in the daylight, he caught himself listening more than looking, watching the way shadows gathered too heavily in doorways, noticing how certain tenants avoided the seventh floor altogether, how their steps slowed when they passed the elevator as if they feared being carried too high. And though he told himself it was nothing more than coincidence, something in the marrow of his bones told him otherwise. He began asking questions quietly, first among the staff of the building, then in cafes and bars where locals gathered, always careful not to sound foolish, framing his curiosity as idle talk, and the replies came in fragments like broken tiles. But when he fitted them together, they formed a picture darker than he had imagined. The seventh floor, people said, had once been let to a group that never spoke openly about their purpose. They met only at night, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, always leaving before dawn. And sometimes the janitor would find feathers in the stairwell, scattered as if birds had burst open mid-flight, though no birds had ever nested there. One bartender, wiping a glass with more force than necessary, leaned across the counter and told him there had been whispers of blood too, stains that no cleaning ever lifted completely, shapes drawn in dust that looked like circles when the morning sun hit the walls. The tenants who lived beneath complained of voices chanting in low harmony, and more than once, someone swore they smelled iron in the air, sharp and metallic, as though the building itself had been wounded. Andrew listened, feigning indifference, but inside his thoughts churned. He returned to the flat that evening, with the stories pressing against his skin, and as he stepped into the hallway of the seventh floor, he felt it the heaviness that clung like humidity though the air was dry, a sensation of being watched not from behind but from beneath, as though something in the concrete stirred at the weight of his footfall. Anna noticed it too. She confessed over dinner that she had started dreaming of birds, their wings clipped, their feathers falling in showers that covered the ground until she could not breathe. Mara admitted she could no longer stay asleep, waking at odd hours to the sound of rustling, like fabric dragged across wood, only to find nothing disturbed. Their fear grew, but it was threaded with fascination, because none of them could quite bring themselves to leave, as though the floor had begun to claim them in subtle ways, whispering in their sleep, bending their curiosity against them. Andrew decided to investigate more directly. He searched the building's public records, a tedious effort that took him to the municipal archive, where he leafed through brittle papers that smelled of dust and damp stone. There, buried among permits and plans, he found evidence that the seventh floor had once been divided differently, not apartments, but one wide hall, registered for a private assembly, though no further detail was given. The record stopped abruptly 20 years earlier, and after that the renovations appeared rushed, the conversion into flats hasty, as if the owners had wanted to erase whatever history lingered in the walls. The discovery gnawed at him. That night, as rain lashed the windows, he sat awake on the living room floor with a notebook, writing down every rumor, every dream, every detail the three of them remembered. The feathers, the size, the paralysis, the figure in the corner. He noted times, dates, weather, searching for a pattern. But the only pattern that emerged was that everything circled back to the same hour, just past midnight, when the building seemed to hold its breath. The more he looked, the more the signs multiplied. Once, while standing in the kitchen, he heard water dripping steadily. Though no tap was open, he followed the sound to the corner where the wall met the floor, and there he saw a small dark circle spreading across the tiles. When he touched it, expecting dampness, his finger came away dry, yet the sound of dripping continued until he fled the room. Another evening, Mara screamed from her bedroom. When they burst in, she sat upright on the bed, eyes wide, pointing at the wall. "It was moving," she whispered. "The plaster, it was breathing." Of course, by the time they looked, the wall was still, blank and white, but the air was thick with the smell of poultry and dust, as though feathers had been burned there. Even Anna, the most pragmatic of them, admitted she no longer felt alone in her own body. "When I walked down the hall," she said one morning, her face pale, "I hear footsteps that aren't mine. Not behind me, not ahead. Inside me, as if someone else is learning to walk where I walk." The dread was not confined to dreams or stray sounds any longer. It was in the structure itself, embedded like marrow and bone, seeping into them with every breath. Andrew realized that the 7th floor was less a residence than a residue, a chamber steeped in intentions that had never been dissolved. The rituals had ended, yes, but their echo had not. Energy, he thought grimly, was never lost. It transformed, it shifted, but it remained, and here it had remained too long. That night, when the sigh came again, closer than ever, he did not flinch. He whispered into the dark, not knowing why, only knowing that something in him demanded to speak. "What do you want?" The room fell silent. Then faintly, from the wall behind his bed, came a rustle like thousands of feathers stirring all at once, and a voice so low it was almost breath itself. "To be remembered." And he lay frozen, heart pounding, the truth pressing down on him like a weight. The 7th floor did not seek to harm them for the sake of cruelty. It sought acknowledgement, a witness to rituals that time had tried to bury, a continuity of memory. But whether that need would consume them, or simply mark them, he could not yet tell. Andrew had grown tired of second-hand stories and fractured memories, tired of whispers traded in hallways and muttered warnings that trailed off before they reached clarity. He was not a man who surrendered easily to fear, and yet fear had already seeped into him, turning every night into a vigil and every sigh into a threat. If the 7th floor demanded witnesses, then he would face it directly, not as a victim, but as someone who wanted to see for himself what had been hidden under layers of silence. It was Anna who agreed to stay with him that night. Mara had grown pale and restless, barely able to look at the walls without trembling, so she took a room elsewhere. Anna, steadier, though her voice carried the hesitation of someone forcing bravery, told him she could not let him do it alone. They made a pact to stay awake past midnight, to listen, to watch, to write down every detail, as if documenting the truth might offer protection. The air in the flat was heavy, even before darkness settled. The rain had ceased, but the city's hush felt unnatural, as though the streets below had fallen under the same spell as the 7th floor. The clock in the living room ticked loudly, marking each minute with the weight of inevitability. They began simply, sitting at the table with notebooks and a lantern left burning low, trying to act as if this were an ordinary experiment. Andrew jotted down the time, the silence, the subtle tremor of unease that threaded through the apartment. Anna busied herself with sketching the outline of the room, noting where they sat, where the light fell, as though mapping the space could keep it contained. Midnight crept closer, and the change was subtle but unmistakable. The temperature dropped, not with the draft of winter air, but with the sinking cold of a cellar buried deep underground. Andrew's breath fogged faintly, though no window was open. Anna shivered and drew her sweater tighter, her pen hesitating midline. Then the sound began. It was not chanting at first, but rustling, as though feathers were being shaken loose in a room they could not see. The sound grew, spreading into every corner, and with it came the unmistakable smell of iron, sharp and wet, like blood spilled onto cold stone. Andrew steadied his voice, whispering into the dark. "Do you hear it?" Anna nodded, her eyes wide. "It's coming from the walls." The rustling swelled until it became rhythm, a cadence that shaped itself into low murmurs. Not language, not exactly, but intonation. The hum of voices layering upon one another until the very air seemed to vibrate. Andrew pressed his palms flat to the table, anchoring himself, fighting the impulse to bolt for the door. He reminded himself of the pact: stay, watch, record. Then the light shifted. The lantern flickered once, twice, and then steadied, but the glow no longer illuminated the room as it had. The walls rippled, faintly at first, then with certainty, their plaster bending inward as if breathing. Dark shapes gathered there, smudges of shadow that stretched long and tall until they resembled figures standing in a circle. Anna clutched his arm, her nails digging through the fabric of his sleeve. "They're here," she whispered, voice breaking. The figures swayed together, their movements perfectly aligned, as though bound to a rhythm that pulsed through the floor. Feathers drifted down, not imagined this time, but real, catching in their hair, settling on their clothes. Andrew brushed one from his wrist and felt the texture. It was damp, as if pulled from the body of a bird not long dead. The murmurs grew louder, rising into a chant that coiled around them. Andrew could not recognize the words, but the sound pressed against his chest, sinking into his ribs, each syllable vibrating like a hammer against bone. The circle of shadows leaned closer, and for the first time Andrew felt that they were not reenacting but continuing, that the ritual had never ended, that they had only been waiting for witnesses to complete it. On the table before them, the notebook pages stirred as if touched by unseen hands. Words appeared where Andrew had left only blank space lines scrawled in dark ink that did not belong to his pen. He stared, breath caught, as letters formed. "Do not forget us," Anna gasped, slamming the notebook shut, but the voices only surged louder, their cadence breaking into desperate cries. The air thickened with heat, the cold replaced by suffocating warmth, as though fire licked just beneath the floorboards. Andrew rose to his feet, heart racing. The shadows turned, every head or what might have been heads facing him now. Their chanting faltered into silence, leaving only the sound of breathing, dozens of breaths drawn in unison. Then one stepped forward, its outline sharper, feathers falling from its shoulders. It raised its hand long, thin, trembling, and pointed at Andrew. The notebook on the table burst open again, pages flapping wildly. Across the paper, written in jagged script, appeared 3 words: "You remember now." Andrew staggered back, colliding with Anna, who clutched him as though he were the only anchor in a storm. He wanted to deny it, to claim he had no memory to give, but the truth pressed heavy in his chest. The 7th floor was not asking, it was demanding, and the ritual that had been left unfinished wanted completion through them. The figures swayed again, the chant resuming in tones so deep it seemed to shake the building itself. The plaster walls cracked in thin, crawling lines, dust sifting down like ash. The smell of blood grew stronger. Andrew squeezed Anna's hand, his voice barely audible. "We have to hold on. We can't let it take us." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded, forcing her gaze away from the circle of shadows, focusing instead on the single lantern flame, however weak. They huddled together, refusing to speak further, refusing to give the ritual more than it had already stolen. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, until at last the chanting faded, the rustling stilled, and the shadows dissolved back into plaster. The room lay silent once more, feathers scattered across the floor, the notebooks open on pages stained not with ink but with something darker, thicker, seeping in from nowhere. When the first light of dawn touched the balcony, Anna broke down, sobbing into her hands. Andrew did not comfort her. He could not. His eyes were fixed on the words written across his notebook, the ones no hand of his had traced. "You remember now." And deep inside, though he had no clear memory to match it, he felt an echo, a recognition that terrified him more than the ritual itself. The dawn that followed should have brought relief, yet for Andrew and Anna it arrived as little more than another shade of darkness, a weaker one, pale and brittle, unable to erase what the night had carved into them. They sat in silence at the table as the city outside stirred awake, their eyes swollen from lack of sleep, their bodies stiff from hours spent bracing against the presence that had filled the walls. The apartment seemed quieter than it had in days, but the quiet was not peace. It was the hush of something waiting, the breath held between words. Anna broke first. She slammed her notebook shut, shoved it into her bag, and muttered that she could not stay another hour, her voice cracking beneath the weight of exhaustion. When she left, Andrew did not stop her, though the tremble in her steps told him she would never quite leave what she had seen behind. He watched her disappear down the hall, listened to the old elevator groan as it carried her away, and felt the sharp ache of abandonment, though he knew she had no choice. Alone, he turned back to the table where his own notebook still lay open, the words scrawled across it dark as dried blood. "You remember now." He touched the page with cautious fingers, half expecting the ink to smear, but it held fast, etched into the fibers as though written long before the paper had ever reached his hands. He whispered the words aloud, and for a moment the air thickened, the faint sound of feathers stirring, brushing against his ears, then fading. The days that followed blurred into one another. Andrew went through the motions of his work, attended meetings, signed papers, but beneath it all he felt hollow, his thoughts circling back to the seventh floor no matter where he went. The sighs returned at night, softer now, almost sorrowful, and though they should have unsettled him, he found himself listening with a strange, reluctant sympathy. Anna, on the other hand, unraveled quickly. She returned once, pale and trembling, claiming she had not slept since the ritual. Her dreams were filled with feathers falling endlessly, covering her mouth, suffocating her. She spoke of faces pressed against the plaster, of voices whispering not words but memories, flashes of images that did not belong to her but had been forced into her mind, hands raised in prayer, circles of ash on the floor, a fire burning with no smoke. "I can't do it," she whispered to him one evening, her hands shaking as she clutched a cup of tea she never drank. "I thought I was strong, but it doesn't want me to remember. It wants me to live what it remembers." He tried to comfort her, but the truth was that he too had begun to feel the same snatches of memory that did not belong to him bleeding into his thoughts, moments of recognition when he passed a shadow or heard a breath in the silence. He knew with a clarity that frightened him that the seventh floor was not inventing these visions. It was passing them on, storing its history in the bodies of those who lingered too long. Anna left for good soon after. No farewell, no explanation. One morning her room was empty, her belongings gone. Andrew found a single page left behind on the desk, a sheet torn from her notebook with words scrawled in a frantic hand. "They only want to be remembered. Don't let them through you." He carried that page in his pocket for days, unfolding it again and again, tracing the indentations of her writing, as though they might reveal more. Yet the message was plain. She had fled, but the memory she carried would follow. Perhaps it had already broken her. Andrew, however, remained. Not out of courage, but because he felt the strange certainty that leaving would change nothing. The seventh floor had marked him. Its presence was in the walls, yes, but it was also in him now, in the bruises of his thoughts, in the weight behind his ribs. Distance would not dissolve it. Running would not silence it. As the nights passed, his fear softened into something else, something almost like resignation. The sighs at his ear no longer startled him. They saddened him. The rustle of feathers became a lullaby, a rhythm that carried him towards sleep. He understood, slowly, that this was never about harm. The seventh floor did not crave blood or terror for its own sake. It craved witness. It needed someone to remember what had been done within its walls, to carry forward the echo of ceremonies abandoned, to keep alive a history that time had tried to bury. He realized that perhaps all the manifestations, the feathers, the paralysis, the whispers were not attacks but gestures, desperate attempts to be acknowledged. The ritual had been broken, the circle incomplete, and the energies bound there had nowhere else to go. They clung to the living not to destroy them, but to inscribe themselves upon them, to carve memory into flesh so that forgetting would be impossible. One night, he sat in the living room with his notebook open, pen poised. When the sigh came, he did not flinch. Instead, he asked softly, "What do you want me to write?" The pen moved. His hand trembled, but it moved nonetheless, words spilling across the page that were not his own. Names, dates, fragments of songs hummed in tones he had never heard, symbols drawn in lines that curved like wings. He did not resist. He let the page fill, line after line, until the ink ran dry. When at last he looked down, the notebook bore no coherent story, only fragments that meant nothing to him but must have meant everything to those who had stood in the circle long ago. He closed the book gently, a strange peace settling over him, though beneath it throbbed a fear he dared not name that he was no longer himself alone, that he had become an extension of their memory, a vessel for echoes that refused to die. By morning, Andrew felt the weight more keenly than ever, but it was not the crushing terror of that first night. It was the heaviness of responsibility, the knowledge that he had been chosen not for his belief or disbelief, but simply because he had stayed, because he had listened. Anna had fled, Mara had denied, but he remained, and in remaining he had given the seventh floor what it sought. Still, he could not shake one final dread. If memory was all it wanted, then why the sighs that pressed so close? Why the rustle of feathers in his dreams? Why the words etched into his notebooks with such desperate force? Memory alone should not need such hunger. Perhaps it was not only remembrance they desired. Perhaps it was voice. And perhaps, by telling this story now, by giving them my words, I have given them exactly that. The city forgot quickly, as cities always do. The tenants whispered for a while about the girl who left in the night and never came back, about the strange man who kept late hours scribbling in notebooks, about the sighs that sometimes seeped from the seventh floor vents even when no one was supposed to be home. But eventually the rhythm of traffic and trade smothered those murmurs, and the building's history sank back beneath the dust of ordinary days. Only Andrew remained, moving through the halls like a shadow of himself. The man who had once dismissed superstition, now bound by it more completely than anyone could imagine. He no longer fought the whispers. He wrote them. His notebooks multiplied, filled not with his own thoughts but with fragments that came to him unbidden, names of the forgotten, verses in tongues he could not speak yet somehow traced perfectly, diagrams of circles and feathers and ash. Sometimes he woke to find pages already filled, ink staining his hands though he had no memory of writing. Other times he caught himself speaking aloud in a voice too low, too weary to be his, a voice that seemed older than the building itself. Anna was gone. Mara had fled, yet Andrew carried them too, for in his dreams he heard their voices mingled with the chant, pleading and warning in equal measure. But when he woke, the message was always the same, pressed into his mind with the weight of inevitability, to be remembered. At first he thought he could contain it, that the act of writing was enough to satisfy the need, but soon he realized containment was a lie. The residue of the past was not content to linger in pages hidden away. It demanded to be carried forward, to be spoken, to be shared. And Andrew, exhausted, hollow, too far gone to resist, found himself telling the stories aloud. At meetings, he would drift from numbers into fragments of ritual. At bars, he would lean close to strangers and whisper about feathers in dark rooms. On trains, he would murmur to the glass as the countryside slipped past, describing the circle of shadows as though recounting a dream. People listened, not because they wanted to, but because his voice compelled them, low and steady, weighted with a sadness that drew them in. And once they had heard, they carried the fragments with them, waking to the rustle of feathers, hearing sighs pressed close to their ears. Andrew saw it in their eyes, the way recognition bloomed too late, the way they blinked as though remembering something they had never lived. The residue had found its way into them, spreading like smoke. He became less a man than a vessel, wandering from place to place with notebooks that never emptied, each filled with the same broken phrases, the same desperate plea for remembrance. His business trips multiplied, or perhaps he sought them out now, traveling not for contracts but for new ears to carry the weight. In every city, in every rented room, he spoke quietly of the seventh floor, of feathers falling, of walls that breathed. He never used the same words twice, yet the story never changed, and everywhere he went, people began to dream. They dreamed of birds with wings too heavy to lift, of circles marked in dust, of whispers that pressed against their ribs. They dreamed of a sigh so close it chilled the marrow, of a weight that pinned them to the bed, and when they woke, they remembered just enough to speak of it, passing fragments to others, never knowing they had become part of the ritual themselves. Andrew did not see himself as cursed anymore. He saw himself as necessary. The rituals had ended long ago, but memory was a ritual too, and he had become its priest, its keeper, its unwilling but inevitable vessel. In quiet moments he wondered if there had ever been choice, or if the moment he stepped onto the seventh floor the decision had been made for him. But even those doubts faded. The work continued. The sighs grew quieter, contented, as though the residue no longer needed to press so hard against him because it had found 1,000 other lungs to breathe through. And so he told it again and again, each time in a voice softer, slower, heavier, until the words themselves seemed less his than theirs. He told it to strangers, to colleagues, to anyone who lingered too long in his presence. And now, he has told it to you. You may think this is only a story, that Andrew Hale never lived, that the seventh floor is just another invention in the long list of tales told to fill the silence of midnight. But stories are never just stories. They are memories given new mouths, new ears, new places to dwell, and by hearing this one, by carrying its images in your mind, the sigh at your ear, the feather drifting across your pillow, you have become part of the residue too. So if tonight you hear it, the faint exhale in the corner of your room, the rustle of something brushing the floorboards, do not panic. It is not coming to hurt you. It does not want your blood. It only wants your memory. It only wants to be remembered. The schoolgirl who jumped. Every town has its own school, with whispers stitched into its walls. And in the city where Daniel grew up, that school was the old red brick high school at the edge of town. Its windows narrow, its halls echoing with the kind of silence that belongs more to abandoned places than to buildings still in use. The teachers pretended not to notice. The students joked nervously in daylight, but everyone knew there was a classroom on the third floor, sealed and locked, that no one spoke of unless forced. The rumor was simple. Once, long ago, a girl had climbed onto its windowsill and leapt into the courtyard below. Her name was forgotten by most, blurred into legend, but the story endured because of the circumstances. She had been accused of something she never did, betrayed by a teacher's cruelty, shamed in front of classmates who had turned away, and rather than bear the weight, she opened the window, and the fall became her answer. After that, no student sat in the room again. The school locked the door, nailed it shut, moved classes elsewhere, but the room never quieted. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, something happened. The lights in that room, no matter how many times replaced, would cut out completely, the circuit itself burning dark, and if anyone dared to strike a match or light a candle, the flame would gutter and die as if a breath had passed directly across it. Those who lingered near the door swore they heard sobbing from the other side, muffled and wet, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her final cries. And some said that if you dared to press your ear against the wood, you would hear a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging against the inside of a coffin. Daniel had never believed fully in the stories, but he had never dismissed them either. The school carried an air of unease that no amount of laughter could erase, and when he walked past the third-floor corridor, he felt the shift in temperature, the way the air grew heavier, harder to breathe. He was young, restless, curious, and like so many of his classmates, he felt the itch to prove himself against the silence, to walk closer to the forbidden door, to see if the stories were real. It was Mara who challenged him first. She was sharp-tongued, always daring the others to follow her into trouble. One afternoon, while the sky outside sagged heavy with rain, she leaned across her desk and whispered, "You've heard it too, haven't you? The crying. It's not just a story." Daniel shook his head, more to protect himself than out of certainty. "It's old wires, bad insulation." But Mara smiled, a smile that cut deep. "Then you won't mind proving it." That was how it began, a pact between four friends, whispered in the cafeteria where teachers' ears could not reach. They would slip into the forbidden room at night, just once, to see for themselves what lingered there. It was reckless, but in the way of youth it felt less like danger than inevitability, as though the story had been waiting for them all along. The night chosen was the anniversary. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the windows, and thunder rumbled low enough to shake the lockers as they crept through the hall. The janitor's keys had been stolen briefly from a desk drawer, and with them the lock surrendered easily. When the door swung open, the smell struck first dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. Inside, the room was frozen in time. Desks sat in neat rows, their surfaces carved with names that had long since graduated into oblivion. Chalk dust clung stubbornly to the blackboard. The air was damp and still. At the far end, the window loomed, its glass streaked with rain, the courtyard 3 stories below swallowing what little light remained. They lit a candle on the nearest desk. For a moment the flame burned steady, casting soft orange against their faces. Then, as the thunder rolled, a draft they could not feel swept through, and the flame bent sideways, sputtered, and died. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence, but silence filled with something else, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then the sobbing began. It was faint, almost delicate, but unmistakable, a girl's weeping, fragile and breaking, drifting from the far corner of the room. The 4 of them froze, their eyes straining in the dimness. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to laugh, to insist it was the storm, the pipes, anything but what it sounded like. but the sound persisted, rising and falling with the rhythm of despair. And then, through the darkness, they saw it. By the window, faint as smoke, a figure stood. Not fully formed, not flesh, but the outline of a girl, her hair falling over her face, her uniform torn. She turned slowly, and though her face was blurred, her legs hung unnaturally, feet swaying inches above the ground, toes never touching the floor. She was suspended in the moment of her death, forever caught between the window and the fall. Mara gasped, her hand clutching Daniel's sleeve, but he could not move. None of them could. The figure hovered, head bowed, shoulders trembling with sobs that filled the air like cold water. And then, as lightning flared outside, the ghost lifted her head. Her eyes, though empty, seemed to look directly at them. They fled. The door slammed shut behind them with a force that shook the hall, the sound echoing down the stairwell as they stumbled away, their breaths ragged, their bodies soaked with sweat and rain. None of them spoke until they were safely outside, the storm soaking their hair and clothes, the night air a relief against the suffocating heaviness of the classroom. But Daniel knew, even as they stood in the rain, that something had followed them. The sobs still echoed faintly in his ears, and when he glanced back at the dark windows of the third floor, he thought he saw her still standing there, waiting, her shadow pressed against the glass. In the days that followed their first intrusion, the four friends spoke little of what they had seen, yet the silence between them carried more weight than words ever could. Each glance exchanged in the hallways was taut with the memory of that room, the figure at the window, the sobs that filled the air like water pressing against their lungs. They told themselves it had been the storm, the lightning, exhaustion playing tricks on their eyes, but no one truly believed it, and perhaps that was why, despite fear, despite common sense, they felt the need to return. It was Mara who voiced it first. Her eyes were ringed with sleepless shadows, her voice brittle with something between defiance and dread. If we don't go back, we'll never know. Maybe it was just the storm. Maybe it wasn't her at all. But we won't be able to forget unless we're sure. Daniel wanted to refuse, yet even as he shook his head, he knew she was right. The image of the girl's swaying legs haunted him each night when he tried to close his eyes, her gaze pressed against his mind like a stain that refused to wash away. He dreamed of the window, the rain, the silence that followed her fall, and each time he woke drenched in sweat, the echo of sobbing still in his ears. To stay away was impossible. The room had already claimed their thoughts. So, on the following Friday, after classes emptied and the corridors dimmed with the sinking sun, they gathered once more at the stairwell. The building seemed even older in twilight, the brick walls soaking up the fading light until the hallways turned the color of bruises. Their footsteps echoed as they climbed, each step slower than the last, as if the air itself thickened with resistance the closer they drew to the third floor. The door looked the same, plain wood, metal handle dulled by years of disuse, but something about it seemed more aware this time, as though it had been waiting. Daniel held the stolen key again, and when it slid into the lock, a shiver traveled through his hand into his chest. The door opened with less effort than before, swinging inward as if it had been expecting them. Inside, the classroom was unchanged. Rows of desks, chalk still smudged across the board, the window at the far end streaked with rain that had not fallen that day. Yet the air was different, heavier, close with the smell of damp stone and old iron. They stepped inside together. Mara lit another candle, her hands trembling though she tried to disguise it. The flame flickered stubbornly, burning longer than last time. For a heartbeat, relief loosened their chests. Then, as the clock in the hallway struck midnight, the flame bent violently sideways and went out, plunging them into a darkness deeper than before. The sobbing returned, not faint this time, but sharp, immediate, as though the girl were seated at the desk beside them. It cut through the room in ragged bursts, each cry trembling with despair so raw that Daniel felt his own throat tighten in sympathy. He reached blindly for Mara's hand, and she gripped his with force that nearly hurt. A draft stirred. Papers shuffled across the desks, though none had been there moments before. Their outlines glowed faintly, faint scribbles visible even in the dark. Words scrawled across pages that had not existed when they entered. Daniel leaned closer and froze. The words were not random, they were pleas. Help me. Believe me. It wasn't true. Mara gasped, pulling him back. And in that moment, the sobbing swelled into something closer to a scream, high and hollow, echoing against the walls until the plaster itself seemed to tremble. Then the window rattled. They turned as one, their eyes straining against the shadows. The glass shook violently, though no storm moved outside. And there she was again, the girl, her figure clearer than before, almost solid. Her hands clutched the frame, her body leaning outward, her legs dangling in the air. Her mouth opened wide in a cry that made no sound. Yet the silence was louder than any scream. Daniel felt his knees weaken. It was not just that she was visible. It was that she was reliving the moment of her death, caught in the loop of despair, forced to leap again and again for all eternity. The sobbing, the scratching, the extinguished candles, all of it was her way of reaching for someone to see her, to remember the truth that had been twisted against her. Mara stepped forward, reckless as always, whispering into the dark. "We see you. We know you're here." For a second, the sobbing stopped. The girl's head turned, and in that instant, Daniel swore he saw her face clearly for the first time. Young, tear-streaked, eyes wide not with malice but with pleading. She reached one trembling hand toward them, and as she did, every desk in the room groaned and shifted, dragging across the floor with a sound like bones grinding together. The friends fled again, stumbling into the hallway as the door slammed behind them with a force that rattled the windows of the entire floor. They did not speak as they ran down the stairwell, the echoes of sobbing and scraping chasing them until they burst out into the night air, their breaths ragged, their bodies slick with sweat, though the evening was cool. But this time, as they stood panting beneath the shadow of the school, Daniel felt something different. The image of the girl's face, desperate and pleading, had burned into his mind. This was no longer just a haunting. It was a message, a story unfinished. And now that he had seen her eyes, he knew the room would not let him go. The third time was never planned, not allowed. But some hauntings grow louder the more you try to ignore them. And by the following week, Daniel knew that avoiding the classroom only made the weight heavier. His friends sensed it too. Mara no longer joked. Her sharp tongue dulled into silence, and the others kept their eyes away from him as if afraid that speaking of the room would draw it nearer. Yet all of them, in the end, returned. The night was still, colder than the last, the moon smothered by clouds. The building loomed darker than usual, its corridors hollow and unlit, the kind of emptiness that hummed in the ears like pressure beneath water. They moved as though pulled by invisible strings, their footsteps soundless despite the creaking boards. When they reached the third floor, Daniel noticed the door was already ajar. Inside, the classroom greeted them like a stage set for a performance that had never ended. The air was thick with the smell of old rain, though no storm touched the windows. Desks leaned at strange angles, as if dragged slightly out of place since they had last fled. The window glimmered faintly, pale light rippling across its glass as if water lay pressed against it. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sobbing began again, sharper, closer, vibrating through their bones. Daniel's heart lurched in his chest. He could feel it, more powerfully than before, like a rope winding around him, pulling him forward step by step toward the window. Mara hissed his name, reaching to grab his sleeve, but her fingers slipped as though sweat or mist had coated his arm. The girl was there again, hovering against the window frame, her body bent with despair, her uniform torn and damp with tears. But this time, her eyes were clear. She looked straight at Daniel, and in that gaze was not only grief but invitation. Her lips parted, and though no sound passed her mouth, words pressed into his mind like ice. "Come and see." Daniel's vision blurred. The desks dissolved. The candle Mara struck sputtered into darkness. When he blinked, he was no longer standing among his friends, but at the window itself, hands gripping the frame, the drop yawning beneath him. The courtyard below swam with shadows. He heard voices, not of his friends, but of students, laughing, whispering, turning their backs. A teacher's accusation rang out sharp as thunder. Shame, betrayal, the weight of being watched. His chest heaved with panic not his own. His throat burned with sobs he had never cried, and he realized with a chill that he was no longer himself. He was her. He was the girl. Her despair filled him like water flooding lungs, pressing out every thought until only the need remained to escape. The walls bent inward. The room spun. The whisper of jump louder than his own heartbeat. Somewhere far away, He heard Mara screaming his name, but her voice was thin, muffled as though buried beneath soil. He leaned forward, the window frame cold against his palms. The night air stung his face, wet with tears that weren't his. And then he looked down. For an instant, the world fractured. He saw both realities at once. The courtyard below, waiting with brutal silence, and behind him the classroom where his friends clutched at empty air, their eyes wide with horror, reaching for a body they could not touch. He felt his toes leave the ground, his body tilt forward into the void. In that moment, the girl's voice filled him entirely, speaking through his lips though no sound left them. "Now you know." Mara lunged, her hands colliding with his shoulders, dragging him back with a strength born of desperation. The vision shattered. Daniel collapsed onto the floor, gasping, his lungs aching as though he had nearly drowned. His eyes flicked to the window, still closed, still sealed, rain streaking across its glass though the sky outside was dry. But for one terrible second, he thought he saw his reflection not standing but dangling, legs swaying inches above the ground. The sobbing ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. His friends surrounded him, but none dared speak. The classroom pulsed with stillness, satisfied for now, as though it had shared enough to bind him. They fled once more, stumbling down the stairs into the night. But Daniel knew the truth before the air even touched his face. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had felt her despair, lived her moment, stood where she had stood. The room had chosen him as its witness, and no amount of distance would sever that tether. Even as the school faded behind them, even as his friends wept with relief that he was still alive, Daniel could feel her presence lodged in his chest, her last moment repeating endlessly, waiting for the day he would finish what she had begun. After that night, nothing in Daniel's world felt entirely his own. He walked the halls of the school with his shoulders hunched, as if expecting a hand to press down upon him. And when teachers called his name, he startled as though yanked from somewhere far away. His friends saw it first in his eyes, once bright, restless, mischievous even, now clouded with a glassy distance, as if some part of him still lingered at the window on the third floor. They tried to speak of it, to remind themselves that they had survived, that they had left the room behind, but the words faltered. Mara whispered once, "It's in him now," and though no one answered, silence was agreement. The sobs that had haunted them in the classroom followed into their sleep, soft at first, then sharper, threading through dreams with enough weight to leave their pillows damp with tears they didn't remember shedding. Rumors spread quickly, as rumors always do in schools. Someone swore they saw candlelight flicker beneath the door of the forbidden room. Another claimed the lights in the hall had begun to sputter at night, buzzing with static until they cut out entirely. A janitor muttered that he heard footsteps pacing the classroom when no one had keys to enter. And then came the whispers that frightened even the teachers. The room was open again. Not physically, for the door was still locked, but open in a way that could not be sealed. Students avoided the third floor altogether. The bravest glanced upward during passing periods, only to find the air itself seemed thicker near the stairwell, heavy with dampness though the building was dry. Some swore they heard weeping drifting down the steps, faint but insistent, as if the sound sought ears to cling to. Daniel did not tell them the truth that the weeping never left him. It threaded into every silence, every pause between breaths. In the cafeteria, he sometimes set his fork down and froze, hearing her whisper against his ear. In class, he blinked and saw not the blackboard but the glimmer of rain-smeared glass. The drop below. His friends tried to pull him back with jokes, with distractions, but his laughter came hollow, automatic, never reaching his eyes. One afternoon, Mara caught him standing at the window of their classroom, not the forbidden one, but another that overlooked the same courtyard. His fingers traced the sill, his shoulders leaned forward ever so slightly. "Daniel," she hissed, dragging him back, her heart hammering. He blinked at her slowly, as though returning from somewhere far away, and whispered, "She just wanted someone to see." Mara did not let him stand near windows again, but she could not guard him always. The rest of the group frayed under the weight. One girl fell ill, her nights filled with nightmares so sharp she begged her parents to transfer her. Another grew withdrawn, scribbling notes that repeated the same words. It wasn't true. It wasn't true. Only Mara clung stubbornly to her strength, but even she confessed, in whispers Daniel half heard, that she felt the noose tightening, as though the story itself had ensnared them. And through it all, the school shifted. Teachers avoided the subject, but could not avoid the atmosphere. Classes held near the third floor grew restless, students complaining of headaches, of sudden chills, of lights flickering without cause. The principal, practical and stern, ordered electricians to check the circuits, but nothing explained the failures. At last he muttered to staff in a closed-door meeting that the room had woken up, and though no official notice was given, the phrase spread like fire among the students. The room had opened its eyes again. Daniel felt it most. His dreams no longer belonged to him. Each night he replayed her final moments, sometimes from her perspective, sometimes watching from the courtyard below, her body falling in sickening silence. He woke with the sensation of wind against his face, of emptiness beneath his feet. The bruise of her despair pressed deeper each day, and when his friends looked at him, they saw not just Daniel, but the shadow of someone else standing behind his eyes. He began to speak less, but when he did, his words chilled them. "The room doesn't want us gone," he said once, his voice quiet, measured. "It wants us to carry her, to keep her moment alive. That's why it let us leave. Not mercy, purpose," Mara argued, desperate, telling him he was wrong, that the room was nothing but an echo, that they could shut it out if they refused to believe. But even as she spoke, she saw the faintest curve of a smile touch his lips, not of joy, but of recognition, as though her denial proved his point. By the time spring came, the school itself seemed altered. The third floor grew colder no matter the weather. Candles left near the door were found melted, their wax pooled in strange shapes. Once, during an assembly, the power across the entire building cut out for 13 seconds, and in the silence dozens of students swore they heard sobbing drift down from the forbidden room. Some said it came from the loudspeakers themselves. No one laughed at the legend anymore. The girl who had leapt was no longer a distant story. She was present, pulsing, pressing against the walls of memory. And Daniel, who had stood where she had stood, who had felt her despair press into his skin, was the one everyone watched with quiet dread, wondering when he would be claimed fully. In the stillness of night, when even Mara dared not reach out, Daniel sat alone by his window, his breath fogging the glass. He whispered to the dark courtyard below, words not entirely his own. "I see you, I remember." And in the silence that followed, he swore he heard her answer, soft and broken, a voice not from the room but from within him. Daniel never spoke of that final night to anyone outside their small circle. But silence does not protect you from what has already taken root. The girl's despair had sunk too deeply into him, threading itself into his thoughts like cracks in glass, each day spreading wider, each night cutting sharper. His friends drifted away, one by one, some transferring schools, some refusing to meet his eyes. Only Mara stayed close, though even she watched him with the quiet dread of someone who knows a line has been crossed and cannot be undone. The school tried to bury the rumors, but rumors never bury easily. Students whispered in bathrooms, in stairwells, on buses that rattled toward the edge of town. They said the forbidden room was no longer contained, that whatever lingered inside had begun to seep outward. Some swore that when they walked by the third floor, the air pressed heavier against their skin, that their reflections in the glass looked just slightly delayed, as if someone else stood inside their shadow. Daniel heard it all, and he did not deny it. He had felt her despair so clearly, lived the moment of her leap so fully, that he understood what others only feared. The room was not the prison. The room was the door. The truth revealed itself slowly. A girl in his class fainted near the stairwell and, when revived, claimed she had seen hands pressed against the inside of the forbidden window. A boy admitted he dreamed each night of standing on a ledge with the courtyard yawning below, his own feet already lifting from the ground. Teachers avoided the subject, but even they walked the hall faster, refusing to glance toward the sealed door. Daniel changed in ways that were harder to measure but impossible to ignore. He spoke less, yet when he did, his words carried the weight of someone not speaking alone. His handwriting filled notebooks with phrases repeated endlessly. "It wasn't true. Please believe me." His gaze often lingered on windows, on rooftops, on empty spaces where a body might fall. Mara confronted him once in the library, gripping his sleeve with a desperation that made her knuckles pale. "You have to fight it," she whispered. It isn't you. It's her. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice low and strange, as though spoken through him rather than by him. If you saw what she saw, you'd understand. She doesn't want me gone. She just wants me to remember. But remembrance is not quiet. It does not sit still. It spreads. Soon it was not just Daniel or his friends who felt it. Other students began to hear sobbing during study hall, soft and broken, threading beneath the scratch of pencils. In gym, a basketball rolled to a stop near the third-floor stairwell, and no one dared retrieve it, because every child who leaned closer swore they heard the thud of feet hitting the courtyard ground. And sometimes, when dusk fell and the hallways emptied, someone walking alone would catch a glimpse of her in the corner of their vision, a girl swaying in the air, her toes brushing nothing, her eyes fixed on the living. The school could not deny it any longer. The forbidden room was no longer simply a locked door in a dusty corridor. It had bled into the building, into the students, into the very air that filled their lungs. And Daniel became its messenger. He carried her gaze wherever he went, her sobs threaded into his heartbeat, her last moments stitched into the rhythm of his breath. He did not leap, not yet, but he did not need to. The room had already leapt through him, into everyone who dared to look, into anyone who dared to listen. Mara left at last, unable to bear it, but before she went, she whispered to her classmates a warning that spread faster than rumor ever could. Don't look at the window. Don't listen to the crying. Once you do, it never lets go. Years later, the school still stands, its bricks older, its halls quieter. The forbidden room remains locked, its door painted over, its windows barred. Yet each year, on the anniversary, the lights across the third floor flicker and die, and in the silence that follows, sobbing drifts faintly through the vents. Students tell each other the story with nervous laughter, pretending disbelief, but some of them hear more clearly, some of them carry the weight in their dreams. And once they carry it, they never carry it alone, because that is the truth of her despair. It is not bound to the room, not bound to Daniel, not even bound to the school. It is a moment so sharp, so unhealed, that it reaches outward endlessly, searching for eyes to see it, ears to hear it, hearts to feel it. And now you have heard it too. Perhaps you imagine the classroom as you listen, the rows of desks, the chalk smudged on the board, the rain against the window. Perhaps you picture the girl, her hands gripping the sill, her legs swaying in the air. Perhaps you hear the sobbing, faint at first, then closer, pressing against the silence of your own room. If so, the story has already found you. So tonight, if the lights flicker, if a draft bends the flame of your candle, if a sob drifts faintly where no one stands, do not lean closer. Do not look too long at your window, because her pain does not stop in that classroom. It lingers in every retelling, in every memory, in every voice that dares to speak of it. And now, it lingers in you. The ignored warning. It began quietly, the way misfortunes so often do, not with a scream, but with a cough that lingered too long in the night, a faint fever that refused to leave, a tiredness that spread from one family member to another, as though it were passed not through air, but through something older, heavier, and unseen. The Williams family had always been thought of as fortunate, the kind of household where laughter came easily, where the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee in the mornings, where the father, David, was known for his steady work and his unshakable calm, and the mother, Sarah, for her gentle warmth. But by the time autumn settled in and the leaves burned orange at the edge of the fields, their good fortune had soured. The children sickened first, then Sarah herself, and finally David, who had always been strong, found himself struggling with chills that wrapped around his bones and a pressure in his chest that no doctor's stethoscope could explain. The town physician called it a seasonal flu, prescribed rest, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that something larger, something unseen, was pressing down on them. The sickness did not behave like sicknesses she had known. It did not come and go in waves, but clung to them, tightening with each day as though someone or something were determined to pull them under. It was then that Sarah remembered the stories, half whispered in church gatherings and passed from grandmother to granddaughter, about the woman at the edge of town, a so-called seer whose small house was always thick with the smell of burning herbs, whose eyes seemed to look not at you but through you. People called her many names: witch, healer, madwoman, but most when desperation outweighed pride, called her simply the Oracle. And so, one rain-heavy morning, when David's coughing seemed to draw shadows into every corner of their home, Sarah wrapped herself in her shawl and walked to that crooked house at the town's edge. Inside, the air was close and damp, and candles flickered in glass jars along the walls, their flames bending as though to listen. The woman, gray-haired, her face lined in a way that suggested not only years but burdens, studied Sarah for a long moment without speaking. Then, in a voice that was both rasp and whisper, she said, "Your husband is not ill from this world. He carries a weight, not born of flesh. A woman follows him, though she is no longer living. Her grief clings like frost. Her touch is cold but insistent. He must not travel alone. For 3 nights, for 3 days, he must not be behind the wheel when the road lies empty, or she will draw him away where you cannot follow." Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to protest, to laugh, to argue that such things belonged in fireside tales told to frighten children. But the woman's gaze held her steady, and in that gaze Sarah felt something she could not name. The certainty of warning, the urgency of danger. She left the house trembling, clutching the woman's words like brittle paper. That evening she told David. He listened with the patience of a man used to her worries, and when she finished he kissed her hand gently and said, "Sarah, we're tired, we're sick, that is all. No spirit follows me. No woman waits in the dark. I'll rest, and in a few days we'll laugh at this." His voice was steady, but in the pause that followed she thought she saw his eyes shift toward the window, toward the road outside, as though some part of him wondered too. Yet disbelief is an easy refuge, and David, like many men, preferred the comfort of reason to the chill of superstition. He did not believe he was haunted. He did not believe a warning, spoken by a stranger, could hold sway over his choices. But Sarah believed, or at least feared, and in the silent hours of that night she prayed that he would listen, that for once he would let fear guide him. David told himself that fear was an indulgence he could not afford, that the world turned on reason and labor and not on shadows whispered by old women in darkened rooms. And so on the morning of the second day he rose earlier than usual, shrugged into his coat, and slipped his keys from the hook by the door before Sarah could stir from sleep, because though he did not believe in the oracle's warning, he did not wish to see her worried face as he left. The road stretched out before him in pale lines of frost, the trees bare, their branches lifting like hands against a gray sky, and the hum of the engine felt steady beneath his hands, familiar, a rhythm that reassured him that all was well. But as he drove, the weather shifted. First came a fine mist that blurred the horizon, then rain that struck the windshield with a rising urgency, and then, without warning, the sky darkened in a way that felt unnatural, as though some invisible hand had pulled a veil across the world, heavy and suffocating. The wipers kept time in frantic strokes, but they could not keep pace with the sheets of water. Soon the road itself was awash, the yellow lines beneath him vanishing beneath rippling currents. David tightened his grip on the wheel, muttering that it was only a storm, that storms came and passed. But beneath his breath, another thought pressed a memory of Sarah's trembling voice, the oracle's rasp, the warning not to be alone. It was then that he saw her, at first only a figure in the periphery, a pale suggestion reflected in the mirror, seated in the back of the car where no one should have been, her outline faint against the blur of rain-soaked glass. He blinked hard, telling himself it was fatigue, the trick of light on water. But when he looked again, she was clearer, a woman with hair that hung damp as though she had just climbed from a river, her eyes dark, her lips moving as though speaking though no sound came, her gaze fixed not on him but on the endless road, unraveling into storm. David's breath caught, his heart lurching, and for a moment he considered stopping, pulling to the side, abandoning the drive altogether. Yet something in her presence held him captive, not through violence but through a strange, compelling weight, as though she were less a passenger than a tide pulling him onward. He thought of Sarah's warning, of the words for 3 nights, for 3 days, and wondered if it had already begun, if the clock had already started the moment he set foot behind the wheel. The rain grew heavier still, hammering the roof in relentless rhythm, and thunder rolled so low and long it seemed to rise from the very earth. The headlights fractured against the sheets of water, revealing glimpses of shapes that might have been trees bending too close, or shadows moving where no shadows should be. And all the while, from the corner of his eye, he felt her watching, waiting, her silence louder than the storm itself. He drove on, whispering to himself that there was no ghost, no curse, no woman of frost and sorrow, but the words rang hollow against the sound of the rain, and in his chest the chill deepened, as though something unseen had placed a hand there and was pressing him further into the storm. The storm did not simply grow louder, it grew deeper, as though the world itself had been hollowed out and filled with water, the sky collapsing in torrents, so heavy they blurred the difference between earth and air, and David found himself driving not on a road but on a current, the asphalt beneath his tires dissolving into black water that seemed to shift and breathe. The wheel shuddered in his hands, and for the first time in years he felt real fear, not the everyday anxieties of work or money, but a primal dread that told him he no longer belonged to the world he had woken in that morning. The woman in the back seat leaned forward. He could not hear her voice, but he felt it, pressing against his skull like the memory of a dream. Soft at first, then insistent, whispering rhythms that matched the wiper's frantic arc, and though he did not understand the words, his body reacted, a tightening in his chest, a loosening in his grip, as if her grief was flowing into him, replacing his own will. The headlights stabbed the rain, caught the glint of water surging across the road, and then the ground itself gave way. It began with a crack, a low grinding moan that rose from beneath the car as if the earth itself were breaking apart, and then the road ahead split open into a chaos of mud and stone, a landslide in motion, trees twisting down as though dragged by unseen ropes. David slammed the brakes, but the tires found no purchase, the car sliding forward as if claimed by the storm. For a moment, in the clarity that comes before catastrophe, he thought of Sarah, of her hands folded in prayer, of her eyes filled with the weight of a warning he had laughed away, and then he thought of the oracle's words. She will draw him away where you cannot follow. The windshield filled with darkness as the road dropped out beneath him. The car pitched forward, the rain becoming a roar, and in that moment, as the world tilted and the headlights carved wild arcs through the storm, he saw her clearly at last, not as a shadow or a reflection, but as a woman seated beside him in the passenger seat, her face pale, her eyes bottomless, her lips curved in a sorrow that was not cruel but inevitable. She reached out her hand, and though he tried to turn the wheel, to fight, to scream, the storm swallowed it all. The ground rose to meet them, mud and water crashing like an ocean, and then there was nothing but silence, a silence so complete it felt eternal. The car, the road, and David himself were gone, buried beneath the weight of rain and earth, lost in a place where no voice could reach. Back in town, Sarah stood at the window, the storm rattling the glass, her prayers breaking against the thunder. She did not yet know, but some part of her had already felt it, the absence, the sudden emptiness that comes when someone you love has been taken beyond your reach. And though the storm would pass, and the roads would dry, and life in the town would crawl forward, the memory of that night would never fade, because David had not merely vanished into weather or accident, he had been claimed, exactly as the oracle had said. The storm passed, as all storms do, leaving the town coated in silence, broken only by the dripping of water from eaves and the low groan of sodden trees. But David did not return. Days stretched into weeks, the search parties combing the roads and the riverbanks, lanterns bobbing in the night like lost stars, yet no trace of the car was found, only mudslides where the earth had swallowed the highway whole. Sarah stood with them at first, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, her face pale beneath the lantern glow. But as hope thinned, she withdrew, retreating to a house that no longer felt like a house at all, its rooms hollowed by absence, its walls echoing with a silence that could not be swept away. Years passed, and time laid its dust over the tragedy. But dust does not erase, it only buries. The children grew, left the town, built lives of their own, but Sarah remained, her hair whitening, her eyes deepening with the weight of nights she could not explain, because though David had vanished into storm and earth, he had not left her. She dreamed of him, again and again, not as he had been in life, but as something suspended, half there, half gone, his voice muffled by water, his hand reaching but never touching. In her dreams he whispered the same words each time. I should have listened. She did not want to take me away. She only wanted me to slow down. When at last, almost a decade later, workers repairing the road unearthed a half-buried wreckage deep in the slope of clay, the car rusted through, its frame twisted and broken, The townspeople gathered to see what time had hidden. There was no body left, only fragments of clothing dissolved to threads. But the weight of recognition was enough. Sarah did not weep when she stood at the edge of the sight. She only closed her eyes, as if confirming what she had always known, as if the dreams had long ago told her everything the earth was only now revealing. But if the discovery brought closure, it did not bring peace. That very night she dreamed again, more vividly than ever before, and David was there, closer than he had been in years, his face pale, his voice clear, the storm still clinging to him as though he carried it in his very breath. He whispered the warning again, not for himself this time, but for her. Do not ignore the voices. When they come, they are not trying to harm. They are asking to be heard. Sarah woke trembling, her room filled with the faint scent of rain, though the skies had been clear, and she understood that the warning had not ended with David's death. It lived on, a cycle that repeated, a truth that bent through time like the course of a river, returning always to those willing to listen, punishing those who did not. And so she prayed, not for David, not for herself, but for whoever would be next to hear the whisper and dismiss it, because she now believed that the true danger had never been the spirit itself, but the arrogance of turning away from what begged to be heeded. Sarah lived the rest of her life with the dreams, not every night, but often enough that she came to expect them, like tides that rose without fail. And though her body grew frail and her hair turned silver, the figure of David remained unchanged, always suspended in that strange place between storm and silence, his hand lifted as though pressing against an invisible glass, his voice low but steady, whispering words she no longer feared but could not ignore. He did not beg for release, and he did not speak of death. Instead, he carried the same message again and again, that the warning had never been about danger in the way mortals understood it, that the spirit the oracle had seen was not seeking to claim him, but to protect him from something worse than death. Over time, Sarah understood what he meant. Death is an ending, and endings are part of the order of things. But the fate that had caught David was not death. It was suspension, an unbroken moment stretched across eternity, a kind of imprisonment without walls, where longing is never answered and silence is never broken. The spirit, the woman of frost and shadow, had not wanted to carry him away but to shield him, to slow him, to hold him back from a path that led not to rest, but to being caught forever in that endless in-between. He had refused her, and so he had fallen not into a grave but into a place where nothing ends, where nothing begins, where even time refuses to move. When Sarah herself grew ill and her family gathered, she tried to tell them, but words have little power against disbelief, and the young often smile at the warnings of the old. Yet she spoke anyway, because the oracle's voice had become her own, and she knew warnings are not meant to comfort but to plant seeds. On her final night, she whispered to her children that when voices come, they must not dismiss them. When shadows linger, they must not turn away, because to listen is not weakness but survival. And though she died quietly, her eyes closed and her breath soft, the dreams did not die with her, because dreams do not belong to the dreamer alone. They move, they slip from one to another. They drift like smoke through walls, like whispers through silence, and sometimes they find their way into places far from where they began. Perhaps that is why you are hearing this now, sitting in the dark, with the weight of the story settling across your skin like the press of storm air, because the warning has traveled beyond Sarah, beyond David, beyond the village that forgot them, until it found you. And now the question is no longer theirs, but yours. What if the next time you hear a voice in the stillness, soft, patient, asking only that you pause, you dismiss it as fear, as imagination, as nothing at all? What if it is not meant to frighten you, but to keep you from walking too far, from stepping into a silence that will never end? Remember this, the warning is not to save you from death, but to save you from something colder, quieter, and far more endless than death. And perhaps, by hearing it here tonight, you too have already been warned. And so, these were the 7 stories of tonight. 7 memories that refuse to fade. 7 scars written not on skin, but on the quiet places of the soul. We may doubt them. We may laugh at them, but they remain. In the whisper of the wind against your window, in the fragile flicker of light before the darkness takes it back, in the silence that follows when all else has gone still. There are things that wait for us, whether we choose to believe or not. And tonight, you listened. Now, may sleep find you gently, and may your dreams be only your own.